What if the strangest royal rumors, the ones you laughed off as tabloid junk, were all true? The Queen signaling for help with a handbag, Charles traveling with custom ice cubes, Diana sneaking into a nightclub, dressed as a man. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on 33 absurd, ridiculous, undeniably real tales from Britain's most famously private family. These aren't scandals, they're stranger than that. These are the moments that slipped through the cracks, royal myths confirmed in whispers, footnotes, and footmen confessions. Welcome to the bizarre side of the crown. The palace is weirder than you think. Before we dive in, if you're into stories that make you question reality just a little, hit subscribe so you never miss the next royal rabbit hole. And hey, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? Let's see how far this royal madness travels. 1. Queen Elizabeth II secretly loved McDonald's. It sounds like the setup for a bad late-night joke. So the Queen walks into a McDonald's. And yet, this wasn't satire. This wasn't subtext. This was reality. There was once a strange, persistent rumor that Queen Elizabeth II had a fondness for McDonald's. Not just any McDonald's, mind you, but one located in the Banbury Gateway Shopping Park, Oxfordshire, a perfectly ordinary retail space sandwiched between a Next and a Costa Coffee. For years, the idea that the monarch, protector of the realm, wearer of invisible crowns and bearer of the handbag that launched 1,000 etiquette guides, would waddle into a fluorescent-lit McDonald's and order a filet-o-fish sounded like cheap tabloid bait. But the bait was real. So was the fish. It all started as a blurry murmur among royal watchers and Mac employees, whispered in the same tone one might use to describe seeing a ghost or spotting Elvis buying scratch-offs in Essex. Then came the paperwork. Specifically, a curious detail in the Crown Estate's property holdings. Her Majesty, by technical ownership, actually owned the McDonald's in Banbury Gateway. Now, to be fair, she didn't exactly flip burgers on the weekends. Nor was she believed to storm the touchscreen kiosks at 11 p.m., demanding extra ketchup packets. But that's what made the rumor stick. Because it wasn't just about property. It was about presence. People began to piece together sightings, low-level staff anecdotes, chauffeur routes. One source claimed she had a soft spot for fries with no salt, a detail so painfully specific it could only be true or the most deranged lie ever told. Here was the sovereign of a crumbling empire, who'd lived through the Blitz, multiple assassination attempts, and 15 prime ministers, craving McNuggets. The internet mocked it, as the internet always does. There were memes, obviously, images of the Queen clutching a Happy Meal, her corgis nibbling at spilled barbecue sauce. But somewhere beneath the ridicule was a strange, touching kind of fascination. A monarch so embedded in ceremony that even her walks were choreographed. Secretly slipping into a place defined by cheap plastic, fluorescent sadness, and the seductive consistency of fast food. The psychological whiplash was enough to make even the most anti-monarchist pause. Because if you really think about it, McDonald's was the perfect venue for a woman like Queen Elizabeth II. Let's break this down. She didn't need to tip. The food was always the same. No one would ask her to make a speech about agricultural policy. She could just sit there, nibbling a McChicken in near anonymity, surrounded by people who'd never believe what they were seeing. A sort of reverse fairy tale. A queen pretending to be a pauper in the kingdom of Greece. The secrecy was part of the ritual. Rumors swirled of back entrances, closed parking lots, staff told to look busy as she walked in. One employee allegedly mistook her for a lost grandmother and tried to direct her to the bus stop. No one knows if this was true, but it sounds just true enough. The kind of anecdote you don't fact-check because its absurdity is too delicious. More than one source confirmed that her visits weren't isolated. They were quiet, routine, regular, as if she had made peace with the culinary equivalent of tabloid journalism, as if she, too, understood the comfort of a place that always smelled like burnt oil and freezer dreams. The Queen, who had access to the finest kitchens on earth, whose menus were custom-made by French-trained chefs, may have simply wanted a sausage and egg McMuffin like the rest of us. It's almost terrifyingly human. And maybe that's the unsettling part. We don't like it when royals enjoy normal things. It ruins the myth. The crown isn't supposed to crave processed cheese. But this rumor-turned reality peeled back the curtain just enough to reveal a woman beneath the crown who, in between official functions and state banquets, just wanted a quiet corner booth and a hot pie. There's something ironic, no, surgical, about the idea that the monarch of 1,000 portraits, always captured in soft pastels and pearls, may have spent part of her twilight years dipping fries into a paper cup of ketchup while casually ignoring the royal protocols she embodied. And it didn't stop with burgers. Ownership through the Crown estate meant she profited from this McDonald's. The revenue didn't go into her personal handbag fund, of course. The Crown estate is a legal constitutional labyrinth. But the symbolism remained. While the country debated Brexit and austerity, Her Majesty held a stake in the most democratic institution Britain had left, the fast food queue. What started as a laughable internet rumor evolved into a symbolic fracture in the illusion of royalty. Not scandalous, not treasonous, just stupid enough to be true. Just true enough to make you question how many other surreal rumors we've ignored because they sound too dumb to be real. Which brings us to a man who refused to sit on anything that didn't meet his very particular royal standards. 2. Prince Charles traveled with his own personal toilet seat. At first glance, it reads like an Onion headline. Future king refuses to sit where peasants have sat. It's the kind of absurdity tailor-made for a punchline. The privileged prince who brings his own porcelain throne wherever he goes, because public restrooms just aren't regal enough for royal behinds. The rumor circulated for years, passed around like a bad joke at dinner parties. Charles, the eco-conscious, plant-talking, organic farming Prince of Wales, reportedly demanded his personal toilet seat accompany him on official trips abroad. Even by royal standards, it sounded ridiculous, comical, insulting even. And then, it turned out to be absolutely, undeniably, humiliatingly true. The revelation didn't come from a tabloid. It came from people who would know. Former aides, royal correspondents, longtime staffers. The kinds of people who had spent decades trying to make Charles seem less absurd. And yet, even they couldn't deny it. When His Royal Highness traveled, so did his seat. It wasn't just the toilet seat either. That was merely the centerpiece of a much broader traveling ritual that included Charles's own orthopedic bed, specific brands of bottled water, monogrammed toilet paper, a velvet-covered hot water bottle, and a breakfast box filled with organic muesli and 6 different types of honey. It was as if royalty had crossed into performance art. A moving installation titled Entitlement, a retrospective. But the toilet seat was the part that stuck, because there was something so profoundly unnecessarily human about it. Not just the fact that he cared, but the fact that he cared enough to make it a thing. It wasn't about snobbery, not entirely. It was about control, comfort, cleanliness, and maybe, in some strange way, an echo of his own powerlessness. After all, Charles had been preparing to be king longer than most monarchs have actually reigned. His life was one long royal layover. And in that time, he had perfected the art of personal rituals, small, manageable forms of agency in a life that otherwise belonged to the public. The seat was just one piece of the puzzle. According to former staffers, the seat was not only packed and transported, it was also installed at each location by a member of his entourage before he arrived. One aide even joked that it had its own passport, which, while not literally true, is the kind of joke you only make when the reality isn't far off. It was supposedly white leather, custom-sized, sanitized, stored in a separate box, carried, handled, and fitted by a member of the royal household known internally as the valets of the seat. Not an official title, but one said with enough exhausted affection to suggest it had been used more than once. When asked about the seat, palace officials offered no comment, which, in royal speak, is as close as you'll ever get to a confession. The silence was deafening. They didn't deny it, because they couldn't, and everyone knew. Still, the public reaction was predictably savage. Prince Potty, some papers called him. Others ran with headlines like "Royal Flush" and "Thrown Away from Home." The jokes wrote themselves. And Charles, who had spent years trying to rebrand himself as a modern, grounded, environmentally conscious future king, now found himself the punchline of a rumor too silly to survive and too true to ignore. But underneath the mockery was a strange sort of pity, because Charles wasn't doing anything worse than what countless celebrities and billionaires have done before him. Private chefs, oxygen chambers, imported air filters. This was the language of the ultra-rich. He just happened to be royal, which made the whole thing look like a medieval ritual staged in a modern world. There's something poetic about that. The Prince of Wales, heir to one of the most visible thrones on earth, dragging his own literal throne across continents. Not because he wanted to appear better than anyone, but because, for better or worse, he needed it. He had spent his entire life being watched, judged, measured. Is it any wonder he wanted at least one thing in his life to be reliably clean, comfortably shaped, and not publicly shared? It wasn't just the toilet seat. It was everything it represented. The royal family is, in many ways, a theater of symbols. Their gestures are choreographed, their expressions rehearsed, their lives a balancing act between tradition and PR. And every so often, a small, dumb rumor like this slips through, unfiltered, unvarnished, and reveals something real. Something so banal it loops back around to being fascinating. The image of Prince Charles lugging a white leather toilet seat through the jungles of Borneo or the hills of rural Wales is so absurd it feels like satire. But it's real, and it raises a simple, hilarious, slightly tragic question. If this is what he's doing with toilets, what else are they doing behind palace doors? Well, how about covert hand signals used to escape boring small talk? 2 mysteries in, and it's already stranger than fiction. And we're just warming up. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this royal roller coaster. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? I bet at least one of you is listening to this in bed at 4 a.m., wondering if your shoelaces are wrinkled. 3. The Queen used hand signals to escape. Boring conversations. Power, when it's done right, is invisible. It doesn't shout, it doesn't argue, it just shifts things. A look, a gesture, a subtle flick of the wrist that changes the course of events without anyone noticing. That's how Queen Elizabeth II managed her conversations. She had no shortage of people to talk to. Or more accurately, people who wanted to talk at her. Politicians, dignitaries, small-town mayors, visiting schoolchildren, wealthy strangers from oil-rich regions, all hoping to share a few precious seconds of pleasantries with the monarch. She was a woman who could enter a room and trigger 100 egos to simultaneously activate. And yet, by all accounts, she listened patiently, nodded diplomatically, and smiled graciously, whether the subject was grain tariffs or someone's corgi's recent birthday. But the truth, quietly whispered by palace staff for decades, was that the Queen had developed an elegant escape plan. A kind of silent Morse code made entirely of handbags, rings, and strategic glances. And the centerpiece of it all was her handbag. To the untrained eye, the Queen's handbag was a simple accessory, always present, always matching. But to those in the know, it was a device, a coded instrument, a social smoke bomb. When she shifted it from one hand to the other, say from left to right, it wasn't just a whim. It was a message, a prearranged signal to her staff. Please remove me from this conversation. And like that, within seconds, an aide would swoop in with practiced urgency. Your Majesty, sorry to interrupt, but you're needed over here. And the Queen would politely excuse herself, gliding away with the calm grace of a woman who had just surgically removed herself from a one-sided conversation about municipal waste policy. Sometimes it was more dramatic. If she placed the bag on the floor, it meant she was really in trouble. A sort of diplomatic distress signal. An SOS in Chanel. Then there was the ring twist. A subtle rotation of her wedding band or a small fidget with her fingers meant she was done. Not just with the person, but possibly with the entire event. That's when the full cavalry would mobilize. And by cavalry, we mean equerries and private secretaries pretending to stumble into the room with urgent documents that somehow always needed her attention immediately. Now, of course, when this rumor first leaked into public consciousness, it was laughed off. The Queen? Sending secret messages with her purse? What is this? The Da Vinci Code? Windsor edition? But the laughter stopped when insiders, former footmen, ladies-in-waiting, palace staff, confirmed it all. In interviews, memoirs, and the occasional offhand comment to reporters, they verified it. Yes, the Queen used coded gestures to tactfully manage her time. And yes, they had rehearsed responses for each one. Because the thing most people forget about monarchy is that it's not just ceremonial, it's strategic. The Queen was in the room, but she wasn't of the room. She was both present and apart, simultaneously engaging and above it. These signals were her way of maintaining that strange, delicate duality. A life lived entirely in public, but operated through private scripts. It wasn't rude, it was efficient. She had thousands of conversations to survive every year. Not all of them were riveting. Some, no doubt, were excruciating. And while most of us rely on social excuses to escape, "Oh, I think I hear my phone," or "let me grab another drink," the Queen didn't have that luxury. She couldn't ghost someone mid-curtsy, so she invented her own exit strategies. What's astonishing is how well it worked. The average person never noticed. Most of the time, the Queen's exits were so smooth, so surgically polite, that the other party walked away thinking they had finished a charming chat with a surprisingly attentive monarch. They never knew they had been gently, invisibly ejected. And that's the real genius of it. It's not just that she escaped boring small talk. It's that she managed to do it in front of cameras, press, security, and thousands of onlookers, without once looking bored, irritated, or dismissive. She made strategic disappearance look like gracious attention. There's a kind of royal aikido in that, but there's also something darkly funny about it. The Queen, dressed in canary yellow with matching gloves, listening to a local counselor describe pothole maintenance in Wolverhampton, only to suddenly shift her handbag and be rescued like a Bond girl escaping from an awkward networking event. It makes you wonder, how many times in her reign did she sit there, silently screaming into her teacup while someone droned on about their tomato garden, waiting for the blessed handbag lift moment? And here's where the irony snaps shut. For a monarch so associated with tradition and stoicism, her greatest strength was subtle manipulation, not by lies or bribes, not even by direct power, just by the careful, calculated movement of accessories. And if that sounds ridiculous, well, it is. Gloriously so. Because sometimes the most absurd tools are the most effective. But speaking of ancient-seeming absurdities that turned out to be completely real, yes, she really did own all the swans. 4. Queen Elizabeth II owned all the swans in Britain. There are rumors that sound too medieval to be modern, too folkloric to be anything but a misremembered fairy tale. And then there is the rumor that Queen Elizabeth II, constitutional monarch, defender of the faith, quiet conqueror of crossword puzzles, owned every single unclaimed mute swan in Britain. It sounded like something a child might announce on a playground with complete confidence. "My gran owns all the swans." It felt like one of those exaggerated royal myths left over from the Tudor era. The sort of archaic nonsense you imagine being written in a dusty law book next to rules about goose taxes or the proper storage of a ceremonial potato. And yet, against all expectations and every shred of common sense, it was true. This wasn't metaphorical ownership either. Not symbolic, not poetic. Literal, legal, binding. A form of property law so ancient and so casually bizarre that even lawyers whispered about it like an inside joke they still had to enforce. For centuries, British law declared that all unmarked mute swans swimming in open waters technically belonged to the reigning monarch. In more dramatic terms, if a swan wasn't claimed by someone else and didn't have a brand marking it as private poultry, the Queen owned it by default. Like feathery sovereign property. It was a law that somehow survived the Black Death, the Reformation, the English Civil War, 2 world wars, televised coronations, and the invention of TikTok. And the public reaction, naturally, was sheer confusion. Because we live in a world where people sue over the shape of Pringles cans, yet the British monarch can, without irony, point to a wild bird and say, "Mine." The logic behind it, if one can use the word logic that loosely, goes back to medieval banquets, where swan was considered a luxurious delicacy served to nobles whose lives were both extraordinarily pampered and extraordinarily short. Swans symbolized wealth, status, and the kind of over-the-top feasting aesthetic favored by people who thought gold plating made food taste better. So the crown claimed ownership, as you do when you're trying to secure bragging rights in the poultry hierarchy. Over time, the monarchy stopped eating swans, mostly because they discovered spices, flavor, and the existence of non-threatening birds. But the law remained. By Elizabeth II's reign, swans weren't shaped into centerpieces at feasts anymore. They were just cute, elegant creatures gliding along British rivers, blissfully unaware that they were technically listed under the Queen's assets right after Windsor Castle and somewhere before the collection of ceremonial spoons. And if you're thinking, surely this can't be enforced, allow me to introduce you to swan-upping. Swan-upping sounds like a euphemism for something vaguely scandalous, but it's actually a real annual ceremony in which men dressed in red uniforms row along parts of the River Thames, rounding up swans, counting them, checking their health and marking which ones belong to the monarchy versus 2 ancient guilds. It is a tradition so spectacularly niche that it feels like Britishness distilled into its purest, strangest form. Reporters who attended swan-upping over the years described it like a surreal nature documentary, narrated by someone who definitely knows this is absurd but refuses to admit it. The Queen herself monitored the swan population numbers. She received annual reports. She had swan charts. Imagine being a head of state, receiving intelligence briefings, economic analyses, diplomatic summaries, and then a detailed update about Jeff the mute swan who had a promising breeding season. And the best part? She took it seriously. Not mockingly, not ceremonially, actually seriously. Because for her, the role of monarch wasn't about jewels or speeches. It was about tradition, continuity. Even the strange, dusty laws that made no practical sense but carried symbolic weight. The rumor became public knowledge mostly through tourists asking, "Why are there so many swans?" And locals casually responding, "Well, the Queen owns them." As if that sentence shouldn't require a follow-up explanation. It was such an odd blend of truth and absurdity that even comedians started referencing it. Someone once joked that the Queen probably had a secret room full of files labeled Swan Affairs, which honestly doesn't feel far-fetched. If she had a color-coded binder for each meeting with prime ministers, she definitely had a filing system for waterfowl. But what's most fascinating isn't that the rumor was true. It's that it continued to feel untrue even after it was confirmed. There's something uncanny about ancient laws living rent-free in modern institutions. Something that makes you question how many other strange relics of monarchy still exist behind closed palace doors. Owning all the unclaimed swans in Britain sounds whimsical, eccentric, almost theatrical. But in the intricate ecosystem of royal oddities, it was just the tip of a very bewildering iceberg, after all. If the Queen could silently own the nation's swan population, how many other personal belongings were quietly traveling with members of the royal family? Like, say, a grown king's childhood teddy bear. 5. King Charles III travels with his childhood. Teddy bear. Royalty is often associated with inherited power, centuries-old protocol, and an ocean of irony so deep it could drown a navy. You picture scepters, velvet thrones, and that strange, lingering scent of ceremonial furniture. What you don't picture, at least not without laughing, is a grown man, now king, refusing to travel anywhere in the world without his childhood teddy bear. Yet that's exactly what Charles, now King Charles III, has done for most of his adult life. And no, this isn't one of those metaphorical myths. This isn't a bear of responsibility or some symbolic object representing lost innocence. It's not a metaphor at all. It's an actual bear, a very old, very real, very worn-out stuffed animal named, by most accounts, Teddy. For decades, this rumor floated through the royal sphere like a half-joke, that the Prince of Wales was so emotionally attached to his childhood bear that it came with him on official tours, diplomatic missions, even hunting trips. The kind of story you expect to hear about a 5-year-old, not a man managing the Duchy of Cornwall. But then came the confirmation. Not from gossip blogs or tabloids, but from the people who knew him best. Michael Fawcett, his former valet, aide, fixer, and all-purpose shadow, eventually confirmed it. Not only was the bear real, but Charles was so protective of it that only one specific person was allowed to handle repairs, his former nanny, Mabel Anderson, well into her retirement. When the bear needed medical attention, as Charles reportedly called it, she was summoned like a royal doctor. She would patch him up in private, with dignity, as if she were mending a national treasure. The whole thing would sound pathetically cute if it weren't also astonishingly consistent. Every trip, every engagement, every 5-star hotel suite prepped in advance for the then prince's arrival included one important instruction. The bear must come, and the bear must be placed carefully. It became part of his routine. One of many small rituals Charles adopted to make sense of a world that never really belonged to him. Because that's what no one tells you about growing up royal. You don't actually own your life. You're managed, photographed, briefed, and scrutinized before you even know how to hold a pen. Everything is scripted. The teddy bear somehow wasn't. And maybe that's why it mattered so much. According to insiders, the bear wasn't pristine. It had been through things. The stitching had worn thin. The fur, once soft, was now matted and patchy. One of its glass eyes had to be replaced after an incident involving a suitcase. There were rumors the bear even had a tiny hand-sewn crown at one point, though this might have been embroidered myth-making. But here's where the story turns from strange to strangely revealing. Charles didn't keep the bear because he was childish. He kept it because, in a life built around appearances, the bear was honest. It was old, a little broken, and full of history. In other words, it was like him. The British public didn't quite know how to feel about it when the truth emerged. Some laughed, picturing the man who talks to plants now whispering secrets to a stuffed animal in his royal chambers. Others found it touching, a rare, unscripted glimpse into the emotional scaffolding behind a life spent on camera. Still, the logistics were surreal. Staff had to remember where the bear was at all times. It was often packed with as much care as the crown jewels. Rumors even circulated of a custom leather travel case, padded inside like a miniature coffin. No one wanted to risk damaging it, or worse, losing it, because nothing, and no one, could replace it. And the kicker? The bear wasn't even the strangest item Charles was known to bring with him. There were tales of a specific toilet seat, a custom glass for whiskey, his own orthopedic bed, and exacting demands about the temperature of his bath. But the bear, in its own soft, silent way, said more about him than any of those things. It was a security blanket, yes, but also a relic. A symbol of continuity. A private history that followed him into rooms full of state secrets and silver trays. It was ridiculous and sincere at the same time. There's an eerie kind of beauty in that. That a man who would one day wear a crown still held onto the one thing that didn't require him to be king. The one object that reminded him who he was before all the ceremony. It also begs a quiet question. If Charles could keep a bear by his side for over 70 years, what else could a monarch quietly keep or discard without anyone knowing? Which leads us to another quietly astonishing fact about his mother. Yes, Queen Elizabeth II was legally allowed to drive a car without a driver's license, and she did. 6. Queen Elizabeth II could drive without a driver's license. In the United Kingdom, you can't legally own a goldfish without following animal welfare laws. You can't ride a bike without risking a lecture from someone about reflective clothing. And you certainly can't operate a motor vehicle on public roads without a driver's license. That is, unless you're Queen Elizabeth II. This wasn't a technicality. This wasn't a legal loophole tucked in some dusty legislation about royal exemptions. It was a real, standing fact. Queen Elizabeth II, who lived for nearly a century and reigned for 7 decades, never possessed a driver's license. Not because she failed her test, not because she lost it, because she didn't need one. Why? Because in Britain, driver's licenses are issued in the name of the Crown. And you can't exactly issue yourself a license. That would be like writing yourself a permission slip to invade your own country. So, from a legal standpoint, the Queen existed beyond the normal framework of the law. She was the law. If you were stopped for speeding, you showed your license. If the Queen was stopped, well, she wasn't. Because no one in their right mind was going to pull her over. She could have cruised down the M4 in a bright green Range Rover with no plates and a corgi in the front seat, and the police would have politely asked if she needed directions. This rumor, that the Queen could drive without a license, sounded like the sort of royal fantasy whispered between constitutional law students and those obsessed with outdated trivia. But it was always met with the same reaction. That can't possibly be true, right? And yet, every single time someone checked, the answer was the same. It absolutely is. Even more incredible was the fact that the Queen didn't just have the right to drive without a license. She actually used it. A lot. Elizabeth was, by all accounts, a capable and enthusiastic driver. During World War II, when she served in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, she trained as a mechanic and military truck driver. She could disassemble an engine. She knew her way around a gearbox. This wasn't ceremonial training. It was hands-on. While other royals cut ribbons, she was learning to repair jeeps. And she never gave it up. For decades, she was spotted behind the wheel on private estates, occasionally on public roads, and frequently at Balmoral, her beloved Scottish retreat where she'd barrel down rural tracks in a Land Rover with the kind of ease that made bodyguards visibly nervous. Footage exists, paparazzi shots too. The Queen, sunglasses on, headscarf tied tightly, hands gripping the steering wheel like she was late to a fox hunt. No security detail in the car, no chauffeur, just her, the road, and a quiet, completely legal act of sovereign rebellion. She didn't need a license. She didn't need plates. She didn't even need permission. That's the thing about royalty. The stranger the rumor, the more likely it is to be true. Because for most of us, driving is a rite of passage. You study, you take the test, you fail it once or twice. You finally pass. You get the little laminated card and wave it around like a passport to adulthood. For Elizabeth, adulthood began in the front seat of a military truck and never really ended. But here's where it gets bizarre. Even though the Queen had this unique legal status, the rumor always lingered with a tinge of urban legend. Because it just sounded too dumb to be real. Too sitcom. Too Monty Python. The Queen can't be out there. Reverse parking a defender without a single piece of documentation. Can she? She could. She did. And there were no accidents, no scandals, just the image of the most famous woman on earth, happily driving herself across royal lands and back roads, a sovereign immune to both bureaucracy and common sense. And the thing is, she wasn't flaunting the law. She was the law. That's the terrifyingly elegant part of it. She wasn't breaking rules. She simply wasn't bound by them. There's something darkly funny about that. In a country obsessed with rules, where signage and social codes govern everything from bus queues to the proper way to butter a scone, the Queen quietly glided past it all in low gear, immune, eternal, and legally untouchable. She could have driven a monster truck through Westminster and no one could have done a thing about it. Though, of course, she never would. She had manners. And if you're wondering what other strange royal preferences might be lurking under the hood of public respectability, what other seemingly laughable rumors might actually be carved into the peculiar woodwork of palace life, consider this. There's a banned words list. Royal vocabulary is policed. And yes, one of the forbidden words is toilet. 7. The royal family had a secret banned words list. If monarchy is theater, then language is the script. Every word spoken by a royal is part of a centuries-long performance, carefully rehearsed, subtly tweaked, and relentlessly stage-managed to uphold the illusion of dignity. But beneath the polished diction, beneath the layers of protocol and posh accent, there's a quieter, stranger kind of censorship happening. One that didn't come from Parliament, or the press, or even public opinion. It came from inside the palace. And it came with a list. A real, quietly enforced list of banned words. Phrases the royal family was either strongly discouraged from using or outright forbidden to say. The rumor floated through courtier memoirs and ex-staff interviews like an inside joke nobody was quite supposed to confirm. At first it sounded like classic British satire, a joke about aristocrats being too delicate for the word napkin. But behind the laughter was a knowing smile. Because it wasn't just satire, it was true. According to palace insiders, Queen Elizabeth II, and, by extension, the royal household, upheld a discreet but rigid vocabulary code. Certain words were simply not royal enough. Others were considered too common or vulgar, or, perhaps worst of all, middle class. Top of the list, the word toilet. Now, to most people, toilet is a neutral term, functional, ubiquitous. You don't think twice about it. But in royal circles, absolutely not. The Queen reportedly preferred the word lavatory, a dainty, archaic term that evokes polished brass and powdered noses. If you were a guest in Buckingham Palace and asked where the toilet was, you might not get thrown out, but you'd definitely get noted. Other forbidden words included pardon, which was supposedly too French and vaguely submissive. The proper royal response to being unable to hear someone? What? Spoken crisply. No apologies. No pleading for repetition. Then there was lounge, banned in favor of the more proper drawing room. Patio was frowned upon. One should say terrace. Perfume was allegedly too garish. The Queen preferred scent. Even living room raised eyebrows. It sounded far too casual, like something out of a suburban catalog. And then there's the oddest detail of all. These weren't just personal preferences. They were taught, passed down, enforced. New staff in the royal household were quietly coached on this vocabulary. Invitations were written with precision. Scripts for events were edited with these linguistic rules in mind. It wasn't enough to behave royally. One had to speak royally. And that meant sounding like you'd never been to a supermarket in your life. The rumor gained traction when a handful of royal biographers, the kind who'd spent years speaking to ex-butlers and disgruntled aides, confirmed that, yes, these linguistic preferences were not only real, but quietly powerful. One wrong word, one ill-timed toilet, and you could be labeled common in ways that stuck to you like static on tweed. And here's the part that makes it more than just a quirky anecdote. This obsession with language reveals a deep, almost obsessive royal fear. The fear of sounding normal. Because normal is dangerous when you're royal. Normal means accessible, familiar. And once you sound like the people, you start sounding like someone who could be replaced by them. So the royal family kept their language elevated, curated like antique silverware. Not necessarily because it was better, but because it was theirs. A linguistic heirloom passed down with the tiaras and titles. It's the kind of invisible power structure that only the British could take seriously. A monarchy that no longer rules but still polices prepositions. A family with no actual authority, issuing verbal commandments from golden thrones. But it worked. It maintained the illusion. Because the minute the Queen referred to a bathroom instead of a lavatory, the mystique began to unravel. And yet, there's something deeply ironic about it all. Behind palace gates where decisions were made about military ceremonies and diplomatic visits, grown adults were quietly terrified of saying couch instead of sofa. One slip of the tongue, and suddenly your entire upbringing was under suspicion. It would be easy to laugh it off, to call it outdated or ridiculous. But the truth is, language is never neutral. It signals tribe, class, intent, distance. And in a world where royalty is no longer protected by divine right or absolute rule, they cling to the only thing left that separates them from the crowd: carefully chosen words. Still, even the most polished scripts can't hide everything. Not the smell of gin at lunchtime, not the flick of a handbag to escape a dull mayor, and definitely not what Her Majesty liked to do around 1:00 p.m. every day, like clockwork. A little ritual, just a sip, from the bottle of gin she kept right there, beside the royal lunch plate. 8. The Queen used gin every day at lunch. In the complex tapestry of royal mythology, one stitched from embroidered dinner menus, ceremonial gowns, and unspoken rules about how many buttons a cuff should have, there are threads that feel almost too quaint to be real. Like the persistent rumor that Queen Elizabeth II drank gin every day. At lunch. Like clockwork. Now, to the uninitiated, this might sound like a bit of cheeky folklore. A charming exaggeration invented by bored palace staff, or exaggerated by tabloids trying to add sparkle to an otherwise predictable royal routine. After all, isn't that what they always do? Take a mundane habit and dress it up in silverware? Except this one wasn't made up. The Queen's midday gin wasn't just a rumor whispered over kitchen counters. It was confirmed, multiple times, by people who knew her best. The most direct account came from none other than her cousin, Margaret Rhodes, who revealed that the Queen typically began lunch with a stiff gin and dubonnet. Not on special occasions, not during state visits, not as a cheeky indulgence, but as a routine. Specifically, 1 part gin, 2 parts dubonnet, a slice of lemon with the pips removed, served with 2 ice cubes. Not 1, not 3, 2. This wasn't some reckless free pour. It was ceremonial in its own way, refined, precise, practiced. The Queen didn't stumble into alcohol. She curated it. And the fact that this detail emerged not from tabloids but from within the royal circle itself made it impossible to deny. The public reaction, predictably, fell into 2 camps. There were those who found it horrifying. The Queen drinks every day, as if they'd just discovered she ran a secret blackjack table out of Windsor Castle. And then there were those who found it deeply, almost spiritually comforting. Of course she drank gin. What else would keep someone sane through 70 years of ceremonial ribbon-cutting and diplomatic small talk? The deeper truth, though, is that this wasn't about alcohol at all. It was about rhythm. The Queen lived a life so relentlessly orchestrated, every handshake timed, every public appearance dressed and rehearsed, that the simple act of having the same drink at the same hour was its own quiet rebellion, a personal tradition in the sea of national ones. And unlike other royals whose indulgences spiraled into headlines, the Queen's lunchtime drink never became a scandal. It was too quiet, too consistent, too functional. You never saw Elizabeth stumbling out of a Rolls-Royce or getting photographed with a mysteriously tilted hat. She was a monarch of restraint, who just happened to believe that restraint could include a daily glass of fortified wine with herbal liqueur. Palace insiders, when asked, never denied it. Why would they? It wasn't even the only drink she reportedly enjoyed. There were whispers of champagne with dinner, martinis in the evening, the occasional glass of wine, always in moderation, always according to some internal clockwork. But the gin and Dubonnet was her drink, the signature, the royal staple. This created one of those uniquely British paradoxes. A monarch both revered for her discipline and adored for her indulgence. The Queen who never put a foot wrong, except occasionally under the table after a well-measured lunchtime cocktail. What made it all the more surreal was how utterly ordinary it was. Gin and Dubonnet is not a flashy drink. It's not fashionable. It's not something a Hollywood starlet orders. It's the choice of someone who knows exactly what she likes and has no interest in impressing anyone with it. That's what makes the rumor so quietly profound. Because it cuts through the layers of pomp and circumstance and shows a human being, not a sovereign, not an icon, just an elderly woman who, after reading briefing papers and being paraded through a week of ceremonial nonsense, liked to sit down to lunch and enjoy a drink she'd enjoyed for decades. And while some people obsessed over the idea that this habit indicated a hidden vice, those who understood her saw it for what it was, a ritual of control, a fixed point in a life that rarely belonged to her. This wasn't a woman escaping. It was a woman anchoring herself. And in some strange poetic way, it mirrored the monarchy itself. Ancient, ritualistic, impervious to trend, but undeniably personal to those inside the gates. Of course, to the outside world, it was easy to mock. "Oh, the Queen's on the sauce again," headlines hinted with that particular brand of British passive aggression. But internally, it was never seen as scandal. It was seen as sacred. One drink, one moment, every day. But while Elizabeth had her lunchtime ritual, someone else in the family preferred his breakfast al fresco, not in a garden cafe, but on a grill. Outside, on palace grounds, with sausages. And that someone was Prince Philip, Prince. 9. Prince Philip tried to cook his own breakfast on a grill outside Buckingham Palace. For all the diamond-studded medals, gold-braided uniforms, and icy palace corridors, Prince Philip, consort, duke, naval officer, chaos goblin, never quite fit the mold. He was royalty by marriage, not by birthright. An outsider who never entirely played by the rules, but instead grumbled at them, stepped over them, or turned them into the punchline of his own jokes. So when rumors began to spread that Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, had a peculiar habit of cooking his own breakfast on a portable barbecue grill outside Buckingham Palace, it sounded absurd. Not in the dramatic, scandalous, headline-grabbing kind of way, but in the specific brand of bizarre that makes people lean in and whisper, "Wait, he did what?" The story was often shared in fragments. A palace staffer would mention the scent of sizzling sausages on an early morning walk. A former footman would speak, off the record, of a smoky haze drifting across the royal lawn. And somewhere, always, there was Prince Philip, in well-worn trousers and an open jacket, sleeves rolled up, poking at a portable grill as if he were just another retired pensioner on a caravan holiday. Except this pensioner lived in a literal palace. And it was true. Confirmed over the years by multiple palace insiders, bodyguards, and even the occasional journalist who caught wind, or rather, the smell, of this strange ritual. Philip wasn't just being eccentric. He genuinely enjoyed it. There he was, the Duke of Edinburgh, wielding tongs like a man with nothing left to prove and everything left to fry. there's something irresistibly comedic about the image. This is the man who once dined with emperors and presidents, standing next to a foldable grill in the early hours of the morning, probably arguing with a spatula. Not for publicity, not for charity. Just because he liked his eggs done his way. He could have had anything he wanted. A kitchen staff numbering in the dozens. Chefs trained in Michelin-starred technique. Silverware polished within an inch of its existence. But none of that mattered to Philip. He wanted fire, smoke, and the freedom to flip bacon without a butler breathing down his neck. And so, he did. The grill was usually set up in one of the palace's many discreet garden areas, out of view of tourists, but not far from where royal staff might pass through with trays of actual breakfast. His setup was modest, practical. A relic from his naval days, perhaps. A reminder of a life before ceremonial events and endless bowing. Because while Elizabeth reigned with poise and strategy, Philip always retained that touch of controlled rebellion. The kind that manifests not in dramatic speeches, but in quietly choosing to make your own toast. It wasn't just about food, it was about space. Cooking, for Philip, was reportedly therapeutic. A break from the pageantry, a moment when he wasn't His Royal Highness, but just a man with a fork and a rasher of bacon. A man who had served in war, buried his relatives, walked 3 paces behind his wife for 70 years, and now simply wanted to char a sausage without ceremony. And it wasn't just at Buckingham Palace. Staff at Balmoral Castle and Sandringham House reported similar scenes. Wherever he went, if there was a garden and a moment of quiet, there was Philip and his grill. Some claimed he had favorite sausages from specific butchers. Others insisted he had a special method for scrambled eggs, something about a double stir and a tiny dollop of cream. He rarely let anyone assist. In fact, offers to help were usually brushed off with a muttered comment, or more likely, a perfectly phrased insult. The royal staff, long trained in discretion, eventually got used to it. Imagine being a footman walking past the Queen's Rose Garden and hearing the sizzling of bacon fat, only to spot the Duke of Edinburgh in his windbreaker, half smiling, half swearing at a half-cooked tomato. It sounds like fiction, but it isn't. It's just Philip, unfiltered, unbothered, unironically cooking breakfast outside the world's most guarded building. And the deeper you look, the more it fits. Because Philip, for all his faults and sharp-tongued foot-and-mouth moments, was a man who never stopped seeking function in a world of symbolism. He detested pretense. He preferred boots to slippers, directness over ceremony. And what's more direct than fire and food? The Queen may have ruled by ritual, but Philip ruled, in his own odd way, by routine. And if that routine included grilling bacon within throwing distance of the throne room, then so be it. It was his palace too, after all. Which makes you wonder, if the Queen's daily drink and Philip's personal barbecue were real, what other utterly implausible royal habits might have been quietly accepted behind the palace gates? Well, would you believe someone in the family smoked in the bathtub every single morning? 10. Princess Margaret smoked in the bathtub every morning. It's hard to know where the myth ends and the biography begins with Princess Margaret. Even in life, she hovered somewhere between misunderstood icon and royal scandal magnet. The darkly glamorous younger sister whose mornings were whispered about with equal parts horror and awe. She was described as imperious, indulgent, magnetic, and unbothered by judgment. The kind of person who could silence a room simply by exhaling. So when the rumor spread that she began each day with a long soak in the bathtub, cigarette in one hand, whiskey nearby, occasionally reading the newspaper aloud to herself, it sounded like something out of a stylized satire, a cartoon version of aristocracy, too absurd to be true, too cinematic to be real. And yet it was real. This rumor, like many royal legends, gained traction through murmurs in the press, exaggerated by parodies, and finally confirmed by the very people who witnessed it daily, her staff. Over time, the pieces assembled into a strikingly consistent picture. Margaret's mornings, it turned out, followed a schedule of such rigid decadence, it read like a manifesto of high-functioning hedonism. She would rise late, never before 9 o'clock a.m., and immediately draw a bath. Not a rushed shower, not a spritz of perfume and a palace breakfast, but a long, luxurious soak in hot water that had to be at exactly the right temperature. For 2 hours, every day. And yes, she smoked in it. She'd light a cigarette while reclining in the tub, usually with a fresh ashtray placed on a small table beside her, refilled regularly without needing to ask. She'd smoke slowly, methodically, occasionally reading, occasionally commenting, occasionally just watching the steam curl up like a second veil. The idea of someone smoking in a bathtub is, in itself, already a contradiction. Fire and water. But Margaret made it a ritual, a performance. This wasn't a lapse in decorum. This was decorum, according to her. She wasn't hiding it. She was elevating it. And it wasn't just a cigarette. Sometimes, depending on the day, she'd pair the experience with a splash of whiskey, or a cup of coffee, or both. By 11 o'clock a.m., she was reportedly reclining on her chaise longue in a silk robe, having her hair and makeup done, still not dressed, still not rushing. The day didn't start until she decided it had started. The public, of course, saw none of this. What they saw was a princess who made headlines for wearing Dior, partying with celebrities, or showing up late to official events. What they didn't see was the hours of self-curation, the hours of smoky solitude that preceded her public appearances. The daily ceremony of becoming Princess Margaret. Her bathtub ritual wasn't laziness. It was sovereignty. This was how she asserted control in a life where nearly everything else was arranged, approved, or dictated. Where royal protocol left no room for spontaneous joy, she created a space that was entirely hers. Private, luxurious, defiant. It's easy to paint her as excessive. And maybe she was. But excessive people tend to be honest in ways the rest of us aren't. Margaret made no effort to hide her lifestyle. She didn't pretend to be humble. She was unapologetically high maintenance, a status she wore like perfume. And, ironically, her daily bathtub smoking ritual became one of the most stable parts of her life. The relationships crumbled. The press turned cruel. The public grew judgmental. But the bath remained. Every morning, like clockwork. Smoke rising into mirrors, silence wrapped in steam. By the time the truth of this rumor was confirmed, long after her death, through staff memoirs, documentaries, and old friends finally speaking candidly, the world had already decided what to make of her. But the image that stuck wasn't scandalous. It was strangely powerful. There's something deeply human, almost melancholic about it. A woman born into unimaginable privilege, boxed in by rules she never asked for, seeking solace in the simplest form of rebellion, doing nothing, on her terms, for as long as she pleased. It wasn't glamour, it was survival. She wasn't just a rebel for tabloid kicks. She was someone who understood, instinctively, that in a family where every move is choreographed, stillness could be the most radical act. And so she sat, in hot water, cigarette in hand, every single morning. But even in her carefully controlled world, Margaret wasn't alone in her passions. Because elsewhere in the palace, while the newspapers speculated on scandals and staff tiptoed through marble halls, someone else in the family had their own daily obsession. And this one involved horses, not riding them, tracking them, obsessively, statistically. Yes, the Queen knew more about her racehorses' performances than she did about her prime ministers. 11. The Queen kept track of her racehorses' performances better than her prime ministers. There are two kinds of monarchs in this world. The ceremonial kind, all speeches, sashes, and scheduled expressions. And the clandestine kind, the ones with private obsessions quietly humming beneath the royal surface. Queen Elizabeth II, to the public, was the first kind. Steady, stoic, purpose-built for statecraft. But to those who knew her best, she was quietly, unmistakably, the second. Because while the world thought of her as a constitutional figurehead surrounded by advisors, the Queen had a different passion, a private empire, with names like Estimate, Dunfermline, and Carlton House. She wasn't just fond of horses. She wasn't simply amused by races. She was, by every reliable account, obsessed. And not in a whimsical, aristocratic, I love the countryside kind of way. We're talking spreadsheets, bloodlines, breeding statistics, racing forms annotated in the margins with the kind of fury usually reserved for disappointed sports dads and Wall Street analysts. The rumor that she cared more about her racehorses than her actual prime ministers wasn't just an offhand jab. It was a running joke, first whispered by staff, then confirmed by her own political inner circle. One former PM, when asked what it was like to brief the Queen weekly, allegedly quipped, she was polite about politics, but she lit up about horses. And not just her own. She could recall the name, jockey, trainer, and winning time of a horse from 20 years ago. She remembered rain conditions, regional biases, and the reputations of long-dead thoroughbreds with more clarity than some of her ministers had about their own budget figures. It was unsettling, in a quietly impressive way. During official meetings, she maintained perfect decorum, the kind of neutrality expected of a constitutional monarch. But bring up Newberry or Royal Ascot, and suddenly she was animated, full of sharp commentary, deadpan wit, and the occasional look of withering disappointment if her horse had underperformed. Her former racing manager, John Warren, once described how the Queen would rise early and read the Racing Post before breakfast. She would call the stables personally. She'd ask about muscle recovery, hoof bruises, feed quality. Not as a hobbyist, as someone who knew the anatomy of the business, and it wasn't a passing phase. Her involvement with horse racing spanned almost her entire life, from age 19, when she received her first racehorse, to her final years. Over time, she bred hundreds of horses, won over 1,800 races, and became one of the most respected owners in British racing. She once missed a call from a foreign diplomat because she was waiting on a result from Sandown, which is a euphemism for she was glued to the television, watching her 3-year-old gelding trail behind in fifth, quietly muttering something far less diplomatic than her press releases. When one of her horses, Estimate, won the Gold Cup at Ascot in 2013, making her the first reigning monarch to do so in the race's 2.5-century history, she beamed with an emotion so pure that it temporarily broke through the usual royal poker face. It wasn't just victory, it was validation. She had chosen that horse. She had followed its progress, obsessively. And here's the beautiful absurdity of it all. While the press speculated about palace drama, constitutional crises, and whether Her Majesty had thoughts about trade deals, she was in her private quarters, deep in conversation about breezing speeds and tendon recovery. Some prime ministers took this in stride. Others reportedly found it slightly disorienting. Imagine coming in with a briefing on an international crisis only to find yourself redirected, gently but firmly, into a discussion about the disappointing performance of a filly at Kempton last Saturday. The Queen never claimed to be a political expert. That wasn't her role. But horses? That she understood on a cellular level. And perhaps that's what made the rumor so poetic. The world wanted her to be one thing: wise, reserved, ever composed. But beneath the stately veneer was a woman who could name-drop jockeys faster than foreign ministers, who took pride not in polling numbers but in training times. A monarch who may have nodded politely at her prime ministers, but saved her real enthusiasm for the turf. It wasn't disinterest in politics, it was priorities. So yes, the Queen might have nodded graciously through policy briefings. But rest assured, the moment her advisors left, she turned straight to her racing logs, flipping through lineages like a genealogical wizard preparing for battle. And if that sounds like a ridiculous thing for a monarch to obsess over, remember, This is the same family where changing clothes 5 times a day wasn't a fashion statement, it was a way of life. Just ask her son. 12. Prince Charles changed his clothes up to 5 times a day. There are men who dress with purpose, men who dress with flair. And then there is King Charles III, a man who, even before ascending the throne, reportedly treated his daily wardrobe not as a necessity, but as a fully orchestrated production. The rumor that he once changed his clothes up to 5 times a day seemed too extravagant to be plausible. A spoiled heir with a team of silent tailors and a rotating closet of designer suits? Tabloid exaggeration, surely. And yet, as it turns out, entirely true. Multiple former aides, royal biographers, and staffers over the years have confirmed that yes, Prince Charles, as he was known then, regularly cycled through multiple outfits per day, each carefully selected for the activity at hand, the setting, the social context, and, one suspects, his mood. There was a morning suit, a walking suit, a gardening outfit, a luncheon ensemble, a casual tweed for afternoon strolls, a shooting outfit, a dinner jacket, and if there was a black tie event in the evening, that made 8. To the outside world, it seemed absurd. A man changing clothes more often than some people changed their minds. But to Charles, it wasn't indulgence. It was ritual. This rumor had been laughed at for decades. People assumed it was exaggerated, the result of a few dramatic anecdotes about wardrobe trunks and over-enthusiastic valets. But time and again, the same accounts emerged. Charles preferred precise tailoring. He disliked creases. He had a thing about shoes matching the exact level of formality required by each hour of the day. Former valet Michael Fawcett once noted that Charles had separate outfits for every part of his schedule, and that no item was ever worn without being freshly pressed, perfectly folded, and pre-warmed, sometimes with hot water bottles, other times with a heated hanger. Yes, heated hangers were involved. Shoes, too, were part of the ritual. Aides would lay out multiple pairs per day, each polished to a level that would make a drill sergeant weep. He didn't just wear clean clothes, he wore curated ones. Every sock had a specific shoe, every jacket had a role, every layer had a purpose. It might sound like vanity, but it was something stranger than that, a sort of ceremonial obsession with presentation. For someone born into a role defined almost entirely by how one appears in public, Charles had internalized the monarchy's most sacred law: optics are everything. If the Queen ruled by restraint, Charles operated through precision. But here's the twist. He wasn't changing clothes to impress the public. In fact, most of these wardrobe changes occurred well away from cameras. They were private, almost devotional. His attention to detail bordered on spiritual. Fabric mattered. Lining mattered. The weight of the cloth mattered. There were rumors he once rejected a pair of trousers because they whispered too much when he walked, which of course would be ridiculous if it weren't so on brand. And while it's easy to mock, the routine made a kind of perverse sense. Charles lived in a world where he never got to choose his schedule, his role, or even his future. But he could choose his socks. He could make sure the cuffs were starched just so. He could insist on a fresh shirt before tea and a perfectly ironed suit before dinner, even if dinner was being held in a 16th century drawing room with no central heating. Critics saw obsession. But to Charles, it was control. Each outfit, each change, was a small assertion of self in a life dictated by everyone else. And unlike most extravagances, this one left no mess, no scandal. Just a very busy valet and a clothes rack that probably required its own royal charter. Of course, this did fuel a bit of palace folklore. Staff reportedly joked that one could track his entire day based on what shoes had disappeared from the hallway. If the suede brogues were gone, he was out walking. If the velvet slippers vanished, he was likely reading in his study. And if everything had been replaced by a kilt and woolen socks, well, welcome to Balmoral. the image of Charles quietly swapping cufflinks while discussing organic farming strategies might seem laughable. And it is, in a way. But it's also deeply human. The man who talked to plants and brought his own seat cushions to events wasn't trying to be eccentric. He was simply surviving monarchy the only way he knew how, one outfit at a time. And while Charles changed his clothes 5 times a day, his mother, unbothered by appearances and quietly subversive in her own right, had her own strange wardrobe-related quirk, namely, how she cut cake. Or more accurately, how she very deliberately refused to cut it the correct way. 13. The Queen had a special knife to cut cakes incorrectly. Most people, when presented with a ceremonial cake and a ceremonial knife, do the expected thing. They smile, pose for photos, and slice the cake with a gracious little nod, playing their part in the quaint performance of polite event planning. But Queen Elizabeth II wasn't most people, and if there was one detail that quietly revealed her streak of mischief beneath the layers of royal protocol, it was her bizarre, deliberate refusal to cut cake the way anyone, or everyone, expected her to. Because for decades there was a rumor that the Queen had a peculiar habit. She used the wrong side of the knife to cut ceremonial cakes. Not accidentally, not once, routinely, ceremonially incorrect, persistently backwards. To outsiders, this sounded like one of those silly, made-up anecdotes passed around by people desperate to add some spice to the Queen's famously restrained persona. It sounded harmless, harmlessly false. Surely the monarch who was so famously composed, proper, and bound by tradition wouldn't intentionally commit the cardinal sin of misusing cutlery, in public no less. But then came the footage. In June 2021, during an event for the Big Lunch, a celebration tied to her Platinum Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth was presented with a large, beautifully decorated cake and a ceremonial sword. As cameras rolled, dignitaries looked on, and aides gently hovered. She took the sword, paused for half a second, and promptly jabbed it into the cake blunt side first. Laughter followed. Nervous laughter. The kind reserved for moments when people aren't sure if they've just witnessed a royal faux pas or a cleverly disguised royal joke. And then she quipped, "I don't think this is going to work." The crowd chuckled. The Queen smiled. And then, just as calmly, she kept going with the wrong side of the blade. This was not a slip. This was a choice. A performance. An inside joke with herself. And it wasn't the first time. According to multiple former staffers, chefs, aides, and even royal event coordinators, the Queen had a long-standing tendency to defy ceremonial expectations when it came to cakes. She knew precisely what was supposed to happen, and then, with an almost imperceptible flicker of rebellion, she would do it differently. Sometimes it was the knife, sometimes it was the angle, sometimes she would refuse the first offered slice and instead carve out a corner section that made photographers quietly panic. And here's the thing, she was completely aware of it. Elizabeth II, despite her image of stoic propriety, had a wry sense of humor that she deployed with surgical precision. She didn't make jokes like a stand-up comic. She made them like a chess player, subtle, strategic, slightly subversive. Cutting cake the wrong way wasn't a mistake. It was her way of nudging the stiffness of royal ceremonies just enough to make everyone exhale. Because what's more human than awkwardly cutting a cake with the wrong side of a sword in front of international media? It wasn't just about mischief either. There was something symbolic about it. After a lifetime of wielding power only in theory, reigning but never ruling, existing always as a figurehead, never a decider, perhaps cake was the one domain where she could quietly take control. And what better way to do that than by deliberately ignoring the right way to hold the knife? Royal chefs reportedly planned for it. Some even began to present cakes with subtle suggestions. Cut here, slice from this side, use this blade. Only for Her Majesty to ignore all of it with a smile and do precisely what she liked. She didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. I may not bend laws, but I will bend cake. It's a small gesture, a tiny, almost throwaway detail in a life filled with global significance. But that's why it matters. Because sometimes, the smallest rebellions say the most. This wasn't just about cake. It was about ritual, performance, and the tension between tradition and individuality. The queen, like the monarchy itself, was both a symbol and a person. A figure frozen in time, and a woman who deep down occasionally liked to watch people squirm when she broke the script just a little. So yes, the queen intentionally used the wrong side of the knife to cut cakes. And she did it with the quiet authority of someone who knew she'd earned the right to do exactly as she pleased, at least when icing was involved. And yet, for all her understated rebellion, some royal habits were far more eccentric than elegant. For instance, there was a prince who brought a literal zoo into his boarding school dorm room, one chameleon at a time. 14. Prince Harry kept a pet chameleon in his dorm. There are teenage boarding school antics, and then there's Prince Harry. Born second in line to the British throne but somehow always first in line for tabloid mischief, Harry was the royal family's resident wildcard long before he ever gave an interview, grew a beard, or said the words, "I'm out." Long before the memoirs and the headlines, he was just a ginger-haired teenager with too much energy, too many eyes on him, and, as it turns out, a pet chameleon hidden in his dorm room. Yes, a chameleon. Live, illegally smuggled, into Eton College no less. The prestigious institution where Britain's elite are molded into politicians, diplomats, and men who can wear tweed without irony. The rumor sounded ludicrous, even by royal standards. Not a dog, not a goldfish, a reptile. The kind of animal that changes color based on mood and environment, something so thematically on the nose for a royal child, it might as well have been invented by a novelist. But this was no metaphor. This was a real, living creature, confirmed by multiple classmates and former staff who watched the story unfold with a mixture of disbelief and affection. Here's how it went down, or rather, how it slithered in. At Eton, students weren't supposed to have pets in their rooms. It wasn't a written rule so much as a shared understanding. This was a school of discipline, hierarchy, tradition. You could sneak snacks, maybe even contraband DVDs, but a cold-blooded lizard with googly eyes and a tendency to climb curtains? Not exactly standard contraband. But Harry wasn't exactly a standard student, already known for pushing boundaries, cutting class, sneaking out, inventing increasingly creative excuses for being late. Harry reportedly thought a pet would help him feel more at home. Not a cuddly, photogenic corgi, not a cat, a chameleon. Quiet, weird, and low maintenance. Until it isn't. The rumor had floated around for years, dismissed as exaggerated teenage gossip. But then came the confirmations. Classmates recounted stories of a terrarium hidden beneath his bed, covered hastily with a school jumper when a housemaster approached. Some said he named the chameleon George, others said Frank. One report said he let it roam freely on his desk when no one was watching, which, again, is exactly the kind of chaos you expect from a teenager who both is and is not allowed to be normal. According to one former classmate, the lizard was surprisingly well cared for. It had a heat lamp, live crickets, the whole setup. Apparently, Harry had convinced a member of staff, unofficially of course, to help him maintain the enclosure in exchange for not causing other kinds of disruption. It didn't last, of course. You can't hide a color-shifting reptile in a centuries-old boarding school for long. Eventually, someone noticed. A classmate walked in unexpectedly. A tail flicked where a tie should have been. The creature blinked slowly. Royal reptilian secrecy was compromised. When the chameleon was discovered, the punishment was reportedly quiet. A polite removal. No disciplinary record. No detentions. Just one of those classic British euphemisms like, "we had a word," or "it's been sorted." The pet was rehomed, possibly to a staff member, possibly to the palace, and the matter was quietly erased from the official version of events. But among those who were there, it became legend, not because it was rebellious, but because it was weirdly sweet. Of all the things Harry could have smuggled into his elite academic prison, he chose a lizard. Not a vice, a companion. And maybe that's the real story. Prince Harry, born into golden protocol, raised in castles and surrounded by staff, just wanted something of his own. Something strange and alive and utterly not royal. A chameleon, symbolic in more ways than one, adapting, hiding, changing colors to fit whatever room it's in. The perfect animal for a boy constantly shifting between identities. Royal, student, son, spectacle. He didn't want attention. He wanted connection. And he found it in a reptile that mirrored his own silent, shape-shifting existence. Of course, when the story finally leaked, it was treated as comedy. "Royal rascal keeps pet lizard in dorm," one headline laughed. But those who knew Harry didn't laugh. They just shook their heads and said, "That sounds about right." And the irony? In a palace where nearly everything was controlled, monitored, and groomed for public presentation, a boy and his lizard turned out to be one of the most genuine royal connections ever seen. But speaking of things the royals tried to keep behind the scenes, there was another rumor, quieter, softer, more domestic, about the Queen's lunchtime habits. Not her gin, not her cake preferences, her sandwiches, and specifically, how she refused to eat the crusts. 15. Queen Elizabeth II never ate the crusts of her sandwiches. In the realm of royalty, there are grand ceremonies, secret protocols, and ancient titles. And then there are the oddly intimate, almost childish habits that manage to slip through the velvet curtain. The ones that seem too mundane to be real and too specific to be invented. Among these peculiar rumors, one stands out for its sheer simplicity. Queen Elizabeth II never ate the crusts of her sandwiches. At first, it sounds like something you'd hear about a fussy 6-year-old at tea time, not the world's longest reigning monarch. It evokes an image so disarming, so domestically surreal, that it's easy to dismiss outright. The Queen? Not eating crusts? What's next? Asking for the peas to be mashed and the carrots cut into stars? But as it turns out, this rumor was no tabloid fantasy. It was true, confirmed quietly, and then repeatedly by staff who worked in the royal kitchens, often in tones that suggested they had long since stopped finding it strange. The Queen, they said, had her sandwiches prepared to precise specifications. The bread had to be white, always buttered edge to edge and sliced just so. The fillings were often traditional: cucumber, salmon, ham with mustard, never anything too messy. Never anything that might risk a rogue crumb landing on royal silk. But the key detail was always the same: no crusts, not cut off sloppily, not torn by hand. The crusts were to be removed with absolute precision. Clean, square, neat. No jagged edges. No signs that the sandwich had ever lived a full, crusted life. This wasn't a matter of taste exactly. It was presentation. A kind of visual discipline that extended even to something as humble as a finger sandwich. One former royal chef recalled that the Queen would often inspect her tea tray as if it were a diplomatic document. If the crusts had not been removed to her liking, if they were uneven or too thick, or, heaven forbid, left intact, the tray would be quietly sent back. No theatrics. Just a firm message through the butler's chain of command. Her Majesty requires her sandwiches to be trimmed. Of course, this detail became a favorite among royal watchers. It was repeated in books, whispered in interviews, and treated with the kind of hushed reverence usually reserved for state secrets. Some even suggested it was a lifelong habit dating back to her childhood. That her nannies, eager to keep the young princess happy and well-fed, had developed the habit early on. And like so many royal quirks, it simply stuck. There's something deeply British about it. The monarch of a vast, global commonwealth quietly micromanaging her sandwiches. The head of state who met with presidents and popes insisting on crustless rectangles, just so, every afternoon. But beneath the surface-level charm is something more fascinating. Because this wasn't laziness or fussiness. It was part of the Queen's private ritual. A habit that brought order to a life consumed by duty. In a world where she couldn't control public opinion, global events, or the behavior of her relatives, she could control her sandwich tray. And perhaps more to the point, it was efficient. Finger sandwiches, by definition, are supposed to be dainty, easy to manage, clean. The absence of crusts makes them neater, more refined, easier to handle without smudging gloves or smearing lipstick. The Queen was, above all, a creature of order, even in her eating habits. Palace insiders revealed that this crust-cutting rule extended beyond her personal meals. At royal garden parties, where thousands of guests would line up for tea and tiny sandwiches, the staff would prepare hundreds of crustless triangles stacked with machine-like consistency. The Queen wasn't standing there checking trays, but her preference was law. And once she'd established that she didn't eat crusts, well, no one else at the palace did either. It became a sort of quiet code, a symbol of the invisible power the monarch held over the tiniest corners of daily life. Even if you were just a junior kitchen assistant peeling cucumbers, you knew, cut off the crusts. This detail, silly as it may sound, reflects something much deeper about royal life. The way personal quirks become institutional standards, the way one woman's preferences shape the habits of an entire household, year after year, decade after decade. And yet the Queen's crustless sandwiches are only the tip of the culinary iceberg. Because while she kept things neat and subtle, another royal had no interest in hiding her own liquid rituals. A quiet room, a locked door, a bottle of Dubonnet, and an entire vodka room hidden in plain sight. Yes, the Queen Mother had one, and it wasn't just a rumor. 16. The Queen Mother's secret. Vodka room existed. There are royal rumors that feel scandalous, others that feel charming. And then there are the ones that live in the strange space between, the kind that make you wonder whether British aristocracy was one long episode of a very dry sitcom with a very well-stocked bar. The rumor of the Queen Mother's vodka room belonged to the third category. It sounded like a gag, a cheeky line whispered in a biography, or some Downton Abbey-style exaggeration. The idea that Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, mother of the longest reigning monarch in British history, widow of King George VI, royal matriarch, had a secret room dedicated entirely to alcohol, and not just any alcohol, but vodka, seemed absurd. Or at least it used to. Because like so many absurd royal rumors, it was real. The Queen Mother, known to insiders simply as QM, lived long enough to become something between a relic and a legend. Born in 1900, she saw 2 world wars, the abdication crisis, the invention of television, and her daughter's entire reign. She also cultivated an image of grandmotherly sweetness and floral dresses, all wrapped in lavender-scented discretion. But behind the soft pastels was a woman who, according to staff, could outdrink a Russian diplomat and still be ready for a garden party by noon. The rumor began as a whisper among palace staff in Clarence House, where the Queen Mother resided after her husband's death. Hidden somewhere behind the quiet walls and art-covered corridors, they said, was a private room, not an official wine cellar, not a storeroom for state functions, but a dedicated space for her personal liquor supply. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, but it was consistent. And its crown jewel? A rotating stock of vodka. Good vodka. Chilled. Sometimes infused. Always within reach. According to insiders, this room was less a bar and more a ritual space. A small private lounge where the Queen Mother would retire in the afternoon, alone or with close companions, and enjoy a drink or 3. Gin and Dubonnet was her favorite, of course, but vodka? That was her quiet indulgence. It wasn't for show. It wasn't for state dinners. It was for her. And this wasn't a passive hobby. She reportedly had preferences for brands, mixers, and, in at least one account, ice cube shapes. Staff were expected to remember exactly how she liked her drink, whether she was in London, Scotland, or visiting Sandringham. One former chef claimed that in the Queen Mother's household, the day didn't really start until the drinks trolley had rolled through. Morning tea was followed eventually by something fortified. And when guests visited, journalists, dukes, old friends from the 1920s who were still mostly alive, they were brought into the vodka room with the kind of hush usually reserved for diplomatic negotiations. It was understood this was her domain. She didn't drink in public. She wasn't photographed with cocktails. But in her home, she ruled with a smile, a martini glass, and a twinkle that made you forget just how ironclad her social command really was. What made the whole thing even more surreal was the contrast. This was the same Queen Mother who championed British resolve during the Blitz, who insisted on staying in London during the bombings, who was photographed petting corgis and planting roses, and who behind closed doors had a private room dedicated to distilled potatoes. And here's the kicker. Everyone in the palace knew. It wasn't hidden from staff. It wasn't even scandalous. It was simply part of her rhythm. Some people collect stamps. The Queen Mother collected liqueurs, and did so with the discipline of a seasoned archivist. A drink at 11:30 a.m.? Not abnormal. A drink at 4 o'clock p.m.? Expected. A nightcap that lasted well into the early hours? Documented. The vodka room wasn't about excess. It was about tradition. Her tradition. A space that wasn't subject to royal protocol, or the public's expectations, or the cameras outside the gates. Just a room, a decanter, and the quiet ritual of a woman who had seen more than enough of the world, and decided she preferred it slightly blurred. And the irony? This room, this habit, this entire royal footnote never made it into official biographies. Too small, too strange, too real. But like all good royal oddities, it survived in the margins, told by staff, confirmed by guests, and hinted at in the exact way that makes it irresistible. And speaking of guests and margins, there's another story. One that sounds like the setup to a farce, but was, in fact, witnessed by more than a few stunned onlookers. Because one day, not too long ago, Prince Philip allegedly chased paparazzi off royal grounds with a Land Rover. 17. Prince Philip once chased paparazzi in a Land Rover at Sandringham. Prince Philip had many titles in his lifetime: Duke of Edinburgh, naval officer, consort to the Queen, patron of more than 700 organizations. But one unofficial title, whispered with both amusement and caution by royal staff over the years, was simply this: the man most likely to cause a scene in a Land Rover. The rumor that he once physically got behind the wheel to chase a group of paparazzi off royal grounds, personally, sounded like something from a satirical miniseries. A prince in his 80s, in full countryside gear, gunning it across the fields of Sandringham like a rogue park ranger, shouting at tabloid photographers through the window? Preposterous. Except, as with so many surely not royal tales, this one was true. The story begins in Norfolk, on the Sandringham estate, a 20,000-acre royal country property where the Queen spent her winter holidays, and Prince Philip, in particular, preferred to escape the demands of public life. Here, far from the grand ballrooms of Buckingham Palace, the royal family could do what all royals do best when out of public view: act like the world's most eccentric rural aristocrats. But rural or not, Sandringham wasn't immune to the reach of the British press. Photographers knew the estate well. They'd camp near its long perimeters with telephoto lenses, waiting for a shot of the Queen walking her dogs, or of Prince Charles trudging through the mud in designer boots. But Philip was a different matter. According to staff reports and a police officer who later corroborated the story, the incident happened on a chilly December morning. A cluster of paparazzi had stationed themselves just outside one of the lesser-used estate roads, technically public land, but in clear violation of every unspoken rule about not stalking the monarch's family in their holiday sanctuary. Someone else might have called security. Someone else might have dispatched a polite warning through official channels. Prince Philip, however, did none of that. Instead, he reportedly got into his Land Rover, muttered something about bloody fools, and drove directly at them. Witnesses say the vehicle tore across the gravel with purpose, not at a reckless speed, but with enough force and fury to make the message clear. The photographers, startled, scrambled to gather their equipment, unsure whether they were about to be scolded, run over, or worse, subjected to a very direct conversation with a very unimpressed royal in a zip-up fleece. As the Land Rover approached, the photographers began retreating. But Philip didn't stop. He apparently followed them all the way back to the main road, maintaining a polite but menacing distance, before pulling up beside them, rolling down the window, and in true Philip fashion, delivering a short but memorable message about their lack of manners and the location of their nearest exit. No one recorded what exactly he said, which is probably for the best. The officers on duty that day didn't interfere. They didn't need to. As one later said, off the record, "We let him handle it. No one handled it better." The story trickled out in the following weeks, mostly through word of mouth. Not as an official statement, but as one of those stories that gets passed around in palace corridors and local pubs near Sandringham. It was confirmed years later by a security source who said, with barely concealed admiration, His Royal Highness dealt with this diplomacy wasn't his default mode. He preferred results. The Land Rover incident wasn't a one-off either. Those who worked with him long knew that Philip had an intense relationship with his vehicles. He loved to drive, especially fast, especially on country roads. He refused to give up driving until the very last years of his life, and even then reluctantly. The man who had spent decades walking 3 steps behind the Queen found personal freedom behind the wheel. It was where he could lead. But what's striking about the Sandringham chase isn't just the absurdity of the image, a royal octogenarian in pursuit of shudder-happy interlopers. It's the fact that it was entirely believable. Because Prince Philip's defining trait, beyond duty or rank, was that he didn't believe he was above doing something himself. Whether it was manning the barbecue at Balmoral, tinkering with machinery, or chasing tabloid photographers down a Norfolk lane, he didn't pass the task to someone else. He handled it, directly, personally, and with a hint of theatrical menace. And if the royals ever worried that their odd little quirks might get leaked to the public, Philip's approach was clear. Take the wheel, and make sure the story's yours to tell. But while Philip roamed the grounds, engine humming and temper flaring, another rumor drifted from the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace. One that sounded too bizarre, too urban legendary to be remotely true. Because supposedly, deep inside the palace itself there was a hidden ATM. 18. The Queen had a secret ATM. Inside Buckingham Palace, in a palace with 775 rooms, 52 royal bedrooms, 78 bathrooms, and a throne room designed to host everything from coronations to awkward diplomatic handshakes, it's hard to imagine that anyone would need cash. The Queen didn't carry a purse with a wallet in it, just her glasses, a mirror, a perfectly folded handkerchief, and, if rumors are to be believed, coded hand signals to escape small talk. She didn't buy train tickets. She didn't pay for groceries. So the very idea that somewhere inside Buckingham Palace there was a private ATM sounded, frankly, ridiculous. And yet, it wasn't. This particular rumor has floated through the press and palace gossip channels for years. Initially dismissed as one of those urban myths people invent to poke fun at the already absurd nature of royal life, the idea of a hidden ATM, a cash machine installed for the exclusive use of the royal family, had the precise scent of satire. It reeked of Monty Python. It was the kind of joke you might find in a sketch. "Darling, fetch me some shillings from the Royal ATM, would you?" But then something odd happened. The bank confirmed it. Specifically, Coates & Co., the Queen's bank of choice and one of the oldest private banks in the world, known for its exclusivity, red carpets in the lobbies, and centuries-old ties to British aristocracy, admitted that they had installed a private ATM inside Buckingham Palace for Her Majesty and select royal use. Let's be clear, this wasn't a normal ATM. It wasn't next to the palace gift shop. You couldn't stumble across it while lost looking for a restroom. It was discreetly placed, available only to the highest-ranking royals, and certainly not connected to any bank account requiring overdraft protection. And yet it existed, quietly, unironically, and entirely out of view. Which, of course, raises the question, why? The Queen didn't shop. She didn't split dinner bills. She wasn't known to pop into Tesco on a whim for a bag of crisps and a £10 top-up. So what possible need could she or the royal household have for an in-palace cash dispenser? The answer lies in the quiet, complicated machinery of royal logistics. The royal family hosts dozens of events a year: garden parties, receptions, private functions, many of which involve tips, last-minute arrangements, or honorariums for staff and performers. Despite the grandeur of palace life, cash still plays a role in these systems, particularly behind the scenes. Sometimes, it's not about the Queen herself withdrawing money. It's about the people around her being able to quickly access funds without leaving palace grounds. Couriers, aides, staff needing to sort something discreetly. In an institution where appearances are choreographed but the plumbing still needs to get fixed on a Sunday night, the occasional tenor comes in handy. So, Coates stepped in and made it easy. According to reports, the machine was installed in a staff-only area of the palace, away from guests, press, or wandering corgis. It was secure, of course, as secure as a palace can be, and, predictably, dispensed only from accounts held by Coates. No chip and pin, no contactless payment, just old-fashioned card, code, cash. And while the Queen herself may not have used it regularly, if at all, the fact that it existed at all gives us a strange, fascinating glimpse into the contradictions of royal life. A monarchy that projects timeless grandeur still needs ready cash. A woman whose face is printed on every banknote had, just down the hall, a machine that could dispense those very notes. It's one of those quiet truths that feels like a punchline to a much darker joke. That in the same palace where royal gowns are kept under glass and guests are greeted by footmen in livery, there's a machine that might one day be tapped by someone muttering, "Just grabbing 20 quid for the harpist." There's something almost poetically ironic about it. The Queen, who didn't carry ID, who didn't need a passport, who didn't need a license to drive, had a cash machine in her house. She didn't need to stand in line. There was no paper receipt, just the quiet hum of royal convenience operating behind closed doors. And yet, if you peel back the absurdity, it's also kind of perfect. Because if monarchy is theater, then that ATM was one of the backstage props. A little reminder that for all the polished tradition, these were still people managing a household, albeit one with golden chandeliers and paintings older than Canada. And if the Queen's palace could have a secret cash machine hidden behind marble and mahogany, what else might be lurking in the royal files of suppressed truths? Well, how about a young prince? Not yet bald, not yet burdened by ceremony, getting grounded for destroying a priceless vase in a royal residence? Yes, that happened. And no, it wasn't Harry. 19. Prince William once got grounded for destroying a priceless vase. Before he became the image of royal duty, the perfectly parted hair, the polished speeches, the cautious smile that never quite reaches his eyes, Prince William was quite simply a boy. A boy raised in palaces, a boy followed by press cameras, a boy trained for kingship while still learning to tie his shoes. But beneath the carefully curated public image, behind the layers of protocols and future responsibilities, there was still a child capable of making the most classic of childhood mistakes, knocking over something expensive. The rumor was whispered quietly for years, dismissed as the sort of palace anecdote too silly to be true. Supposedly, young Prince William had once been grounded, yes, grounded, after accidentally destroying a priceless vase in one of the royal residences. The idea was comical. The future King of England, being punished like an ordinary schoolboy for knocking over a piece of royal porcelain? Preposterous. Except, of course, it wasn't. Multiple former staff members, speaking long after the Queen's passing, confirmed the story with a kind of nostalgic fondness. It was one of those rare moments when the strict, starch-collared atmosphere of royal life had cracked just enough to reveal something real behind the gold trim and velvet ropes. A mother, a son, and the unmistakable sound of a vase hitting the floor. The incident reportedly took place at Kensington Palace, back when William and Harry were still young, still playful, and still completely unaware of how many priceless objects surrounded them at all times. The vase in question? No one knows for sure. Some say it was a Ming Dynasty heirloom. Others say it was a French antique borrowed from the royal collection. All anyone seems to agree on is that it was old, valuable, and not the kind of thing you'd normally place within reach of two competitive, energetic royal children. William, they say, had been playing an indoor game, not soccer, not rugby, but something equally reckless involving a ball or a pillow or possibly one of Harry's shoes. In the way that only brothers can, the moment escalated. Someone ran. Something was thrown. And then came the unmistakable sound, the brittle, tragic shatter of centuries-old ceramic. What followed, reportedly, was not a royal decree, but something far more universally recognizable. A royal scolding. Princess Diana, who, by all accounts, raised her sons with a stubborn insistence on normality within the strict walls of royalty, didn't care how rare the vase was. She didn't ask about insurance. She didn't summon a curator from the Royal Collection Trust. She did what mothers do. She gave him a look. And then she grounded him. Yes, grounded. As in, no TV, no dessert, restricted outdoor play. For a boy born into a world of golden banisters and private drivers, being grounded was a rare kind of punishment. It was a statement. You are not exempt. You are not untouchable. You're just a boy who made a mess. The palace, of course, never acknowledged the incident. It wasn't included in official biographies. It wasn't addressed by courtiers or the press office. But within the palace walls, it became one of those stories that resurfaced now and then, usually with a chuckle and a shake of the head. Remember when Wills broke the vase? What makes the story so oddly powerful is not just the humor of it, but the scale of the contrast. William, the golden child of the monarchy, the perfectly groomed heir to centuries of empire, committing the most mundane of childhood crimes, clumsiness. It's a reminder that the palaces are still homes, that the art on the walls isn't just for show, and that even future kings can have bad days. They can be careless. They can be kids. And Diana, whose parenting style often clashed with royal tradition, saw moments like this not as scandal, but as opportunity. She didn't raise boys to be untouchable. She raised them to understand consequences. There's something almost poetic in the act of grounding a prince for breaking a vase. In a world built on inherited privilege, Diana tried, however imperfectly, to give her sons a relationship with reality. Even if that reality came in the form of sweeping up the remnants of a priceless artifact and sitting in his room, pouting, while the rest of the household carried on without him. Of course, William grew up. The incident faded. But according to some staff, the memory lived on in a small, peculiar way. William reportedly became unusually careful around breakables afterward. In his adult years, he would move with a kind of inherited caution around porcelain displays, art installations, and priceless heirlooms. A silent memory, perhaps, of the day he learned, the hard way, that even a prince can't always be protected from the consequences of a clumsy mistake. And if this tale of princely punishment feels unusually down to earth, the next one swings back in the opposite direction entirely, toward roller skates, palace corridors, and a princess who defied every rule of decorum by turning Buckingham Palace into her personal disco floor. Yes, Diana really did roller skate through the royal residence, and no one could stop her. 20. Diana really did roller skate through Buckingham Palace. There are stories about Princess Diana that feel designed for tabloids. Too cinematic, too stylish, too perfectly framed to be anything but embellished. And then there are the stories that are somehow even more true than the rumors. The ones that don't just survive scrutiny, but seem to grow larger and more human the closer you look, like the one about her roller skating through Buckingham Palace. It started as a whisper, a line in a tabloid feature, a footnote in a palace gossip column that no one believed at first. Diana used to roller skate down the corridors of Buckingham Palace. It sounded absurd, not just implausible but logistically impossible. The longest marble hallways in the world, high ceilings, priceless art, and a princess zipping past them in 4 wheels and Walkman headphones? Surely not. Except, yes, she did. The rumor was later confirmed not by anonymous sources or dramatized TV scripts, but by her bodyguard, who told the story with the weary affection of a man who had long since accepted that some people are born to break the rules. She liked to skate through the halls when no one was around, he said casually, as if he were describing someone sneaking an extra biscuit. She'd wait until it was quiet and then go flying. The mental image is irresistible. Diana, 20-something, fresh-faced, wide-eyed and newly royal, gliding past 18th century furniture, dodging priceless vases, skating through history with a kind of joyful indifference that made her both adored and, for the institution, deeply unpredictable. It wasn't a political statement. It wasn't performance art. It wasn't even rebellion exactly. It was relief. A way to breathe in a palace built on formality. The same way a teenager might crank the volume on their headphones in the middle of dinner with their parents. Except in Diana's case, dinner was state-funded, the house had 775 rooms, and her in-laws had the power to declare war. And she did it wearing a Walkman. That detail, perhaps more than the skates themselves, turns the whole thing from a rumor into a legend. According to friends and insiders, Diana would put on her skates, slip on her headphones, and cruise through the long halls of the palace listening to Duran Duran or George Michael. Not for attention, not for irony, but because it made her feel normal. She was, at her core, a teenager trapped in a fairy tale, and sometimes she needed to remind herself she had knees that bent and lungs that needed air. There's something bittersweet about it. Diana didn't belong in that building. Not really. The palace was cold, literal and emotional, run by schedules and silence. But she was warmth incarnate. She needed movement, noise, music, laughter. And so she carved it into the corners of a system that didn't know what to do with her. Staff didn't report her. They didn't stop her. Some say they watched from a distance, pretending not to notice. Others say they laughed quietly, warned her about the occasional antique she was about to clip. But none of them told her to stop. Because by then, they understood. Diana didn't need Buckingham Palace to love her. She already had the public. And maybe this small act, skating through corridors designed for kings, was her way of reclaiming some of what monarchy had taken. She didn't get privacy. She didn't get freedom. She didn't even get happiness. But she got that. A few quiet minutes, headphones on, feet gliding, pretending she was somewhere else, anywhere else, where she wasn't being watched, measured, or shaped into something she wasn't. Decades later, the story has become one of those strange but sacred little truths about Diana. It appears in biographies. It's referenced in dramatizations. But no matter how many times it's repeated, it never stops feeling radical. Because no one else in that building, not Charles, not Elizabeth, not the countless royals who passed through those gilded halls, ever thought to put on skates. Diana did. not out of rebellion, but because she needed joy, and she wasn't going to wait for permission to find it. She wore designer gowns and hospital scrubs. She walked through landmine fields and Vogue covers. She cried behind closed doors and danced at discos. And yes, she roller skated through the Queen's house. Not because she was trying to make a statement, but because she was trying to stay alive. And while Diana found joy in movement, others in the family found relief in words, though not always the polite kind. Because as we now know, behind the facade of royal courtesy, one particular princess was known for swearing like a sailor. And her name was Anne, 21. Princess Anne swore constantly. For a family that thrives on decorum, where every nod is calculated, every handshake premeditated, and even the way one exits a car is coached by professionals, Princess Anne has always been something of a delightful contradiction. Not scandalous, not rebellious in the Diana sense, but blunt, in the way a bolt is blunt, in the way a horse kick is blunt, in the way only someone who was never trying to be liked can truly afford to be. And nothing captured this more than the long-whispered rumor that Princess Anne swore like a soldier on shore leave. At first, it was dismissed as folklore, a bit of class-crossing myth-making. After all, this was the Queen's only daughter, a figure regularly photographed in neatly tailored coats and hats that could double as punctuation. It didn't seem possible. The Princess Royal? F-bombs? But then came the confirmations. Royal staff, former security officers, even journalists who had the misfortune of asking questions too slowly. All of them, over time, told the same story. Anne swore, frequently, fluently, inventively, and not just in private. She swore in meetings, in hallways, on horseback, while getting out of Land Rovers. Sometimes under her breath, sometimes directly into someone's face. One former royal correspondent said it best. She curses like a Glaswegian dock worker who's just stubbed his toe and found out his boat's sinking. This wasn't an occasional slip. It was a dialect, a kind of no-nonsense, unfiltered register that came not from rebellion, but from sheer impatience. Anne didn't suffer fools. She didn't tolerate inefficiency. And she had no time for euphemisms. Where others in the firm would glide past discomfort with a polite cough or a heavily implied silence, Anne would barge straight through the middle of it, often with a well-placed expletive. She doesn't swear at people, one former equerry clarified. She swears near them. It's a form of punctuation. Her staff, for the most part, adapted. They learned to translate phrases like, "What the bloody hell is this mess?" as a mild warning, or "Get that bleeping thing out of my way," as a perfectly reasonable logistical directive. It wasn't personal. It was functional. And compared to the passive-aggressive silence that defined most royal communications, Anne's barked commands were practically refreshing. The Queen, famously stoic, was reportedly aware of her daughter's language and chose to ignore it. Or perhaps wisely, decided there were bigger battles to fight. And this one, at least, kept things moving. Because if Anne had a superpower, it was efficiency. She remains one of the hardest-working royals, logging hundreds of engagements a year, often in places with bad weather, awkward carpets, and no decent coffee. And at every one of those events, there was at least a small risk that someone would hear a muttered curse in the vicinity of the Princess Royal. She didn't do it for shock value. She didn't try to be edgy. She wasn't colorful in the way royals are sometimes described when they say the wrong thing to the wrong person in front of a live mic. Anne's language wasn't scandal. It was mechanical. Like releasing steam. She would curse, fix her gaze, and move on. No apologies. No explanations. But perhaps the most famous moment, the one that truly confirmed the rumor in the eyes of the world, came during a viral clip in which Anne, standing beside world leaders at a NATO reception, was caught gesturing at a security guard with visible irritation. While the audio was too muddled to hear clearly, several lip readers and media outlets later confirmed that her muttered phrase was, "Well, very much not for broadcast. The press tried to make it into a scandal. Princess Anne snaps at security. But the public didn't see a meltdown. They saw a working woman being asked to wait for a cue that made no sense, and responding with the sort of language you'd expect from someone who had, quite frankly, done this 1,000 times before. Because that's what lies beneath the swearing. It's not a lack of poise. It's a lack of tolerance for unnecessary faff. Anne has spent her entire life navigating ceremonies and schedules so brittle they could shatter at a wrong glance. She figured out early on that the only way to survive it was to call things what they are, even if what they are rhymes with hit. And ironically, that honesty made her one of the most respected royals within palace circles. You always knew where you stood with Anne. If she swore near you, it meant you were part of the team. If she swore at you, well, then maybe you should have scheduled the reception an hour earlier. And while Anne's linguistic flexibility might have caused raised eyebrows in the rarefied air of Buckingham Palace, it wasn't even the strangest decorative detail in the royal orbit. That honor belongs to a rumor so strange it bordered on mythology. A story about Prince Philip, a portrait, and a painting of himself as a centaur. 22. Prince Philip had a painting of himself as a centaur. There are royal eccentricities, and then there are royal myths. Tales that live in the liminal space between dinner party anecdotes and state secrets. Stories so surreal they sound like drunken fan fiction, the kind whispered with a smirk by staff and dismissed by the public as exaggerated aristocratic nonsense. And then there's the rumor that Prince Philip had a painting of himself as a centaur. Yes, a centaur, half man, half horse, all Duke of Edinburgh. At first, it sounded like classic palace satire, the kind of thing someone might joke about after a glass too many at a gala. Oh, you know Philip. He probably has a portrait of himself as a mythical beast hanging over the fireplace. And the joke would land because, of course, it felt just believable enough. He was that kind of man. But then came the confirmations. Quiet, awkward, and slightly apologetic. Multiple palace insiders, including royal aides and visitors with the rare privilege of seeing Prince Philip's private office, have confirmed that, yes, the painting did exist, and yes, it was proudly displayed. Not in a dusty storage room or some dark corner of a private wing, but in his personal space. Right there, where visitors might catch a glimpse between the naval memorabilia and family photos. The image was reportedly bold, muscular, almost Greco-Roman in style. Prince Philip's upper torso, shirtless and sculpted, merged seamlessly into the powerful body of a horse, complete with polished hooves and a dramatic landscape in the background. According to one source, it was impossible to look at and not feel something. Exactly what that something was seemed to vary wildly depending on who was asked. Some say it was a gift, created by an eccentric admirer or possibly a courtier with a misguided sense of humor. Others believe Philip commissioned it himself, half as a joke, half as a deeply ironic tribute to his own unique place in the royal menagerie. He was, after all, a man who once described himself as a bloody amoeba for having no clear constitutional role. Perhaps the centaur was a symbolic middle finger to all that, a reminder that while he walked 3 steps behind the queen, he did so with 4 legs and no shame. Prince Philip never publicly addressed the painting, of course. That would have defeated the point. He was a master of leaving things unsaid, of communicating through raised eyebrows and pointed silences. The painting said what needed to be said. It was defiance. It was absurdity. It was him. Staff reactions ranged from disbelief to delight. Some claimed they never saw it directly, only heard whispers. Others swore they stood in front of it, awkwardly sipping tea, trying to keep a straight face as a royal centaur watched them from across the room. One aide allegedly asked if it was part of a larger collection. Philip reportedly responded with a smirk and said, "That depends. Do you know what a minotaur looks like?" Whether he was joking or not remains unclear. But here's what's so perfectly Philip about it. He didn't care what anyone thought. If the painting amused him, and by all accounts it did, that was all the justification he needed. In a palace full of gilded portraits and marble busts, where every brushstroke is scrutinized for its symbolic meaning, he chose satire, he chose myth, he chose the weirdest possible version of himself, and made it art. The deeper irony, of course, is that it kind of fits. Prince Philip was a centaur in many ways, part tradition, part chaos, part ceremonial fixture, part unstoppable force. He was both inside the system and perpetually outside of it. He could deliver a speech with flawless formality in the morning and insult a dignitary by dinner. He could quote Greek poetry and curse out an overheating radiator in the same breath. So maybe the painting wasn't a joke at all. Maybe it was a portrait of truth, filtered through mythology. Because what do you do when you've spent your life being reduced to your proximity to the throne? When you've been boxed into a role with no clear authority, no constitutional power, and no personal space? You reclaim your image. You reinvent it. You mount it on a wall and dare anyone to ask, "Am I a joke to you?" No, I'm a centaur. And in a royal family full of careful symbolism and immaculate restraint, the fact that one of its most senior members kept a surreal, borderline unhinged painting of himself as a mythological creature might be the most honest thing ever hung in Buckingham Palace. It's also proof that behind the golden wallpaper and velvet ropes, the royals, at least some of them, know exactly how absurd all of this is. And speaking of absurd, but absolutely true, there's the quiet little rumor that the Queen, with all her palaces, chefs, and crystal dishware, stored her breakfast cereal in plastic Tupperware. Because of course she did. 23. The Queen used Tupperware for her cereal. There's something deeply British, no, specifically royal, about a monarch whose face appears on the national currency, who lives in palaces so ornate they could be mistaken for museums, who eats off plates rimmed in gold, and who chooses to store her breakfast cereal in Tupperware. Yes, plastic, snap-on lid, mass-produced, possibly labeled with a Sharpie. Tupperware, for the Queen. At first, this rumor sounded like parody, a cheeky tabloid jab or a tongue-in-cheek scene from a royal spoof. Her Majesty, seated at an antique breakfast table under a chandelier, delicately lifting the lid of a plastic cereal container to pour her morning bowl of Special K. Too mundane to be royal, too humble to be real. And yet, like so many of the strangest royal rumors, this one was completely true. Multiple former royal chefs and palace staffers have confirmed it over the years, often with a smile and the kind of reverence reserved not for absurdity, but for affection. Queen Elizabeth II, and the woman who ruled for over 70 years, insisted that her cereal be stored in Tupperware, not in crystal jars, not in fine ceramic canisters, but in the kind of plastic tubs you'd find in a suburban pantry next to the rice and dried lentils. According to Darren McGrady, a former royal chef who served the Queen for over a decade, breakfast at Buckingham Palace was, more often than not, a surprisingly low-key affair. Despite the grandeur outside, the Queen's personal tastes were modest. She preferred simplicity, structure, routine. Every morning, a tray would be brought to her private dining room. A pot of Earl Grey tea, no milk, no sugar, some toast with marmalade, and a choice of cereals, kept in plastic containers. Not just any cereals, of course. The Queen reportedly favored Special K, cornflakes, and sometimes Weetabix, depending on the season and her mood. Occasionally, she might request porridge, but more often than not, it was dry cereal. Dry, unadorned, poured carefully from a Tupperware tub into a bowl, not gold-rimmed or jewel-encrusted, but clean and serviceable. She would serve it herself, no fanfare, no trumpets, just Her Majesty, quietly unsnapping the lid, tipping the box, and measuring out her morning portion with all the precision of a naval officer preparing for inspection. And there's something wonderful about that, because it wasn't about thrift. This was not austerity. This was preference. The Queen, who had access to the best kitchen staff, ingredients, and presentation in the world, chose plastic containers because they kept the cereal fresher. That's it. That's the entire reason. It was practical, efficient, clean, and perhaps most importantly, familiar. Staff say she liked knowing what to expect. That Tupperware, so unassuming, so hilariously domestic, fit into her world not as a contradiction, but as a comfort. In a life dictated by protocol, consistency was not just preferred, it was necessary. Tupperware, for all its associations with leftovers and packed lunches, delivered that consistency every single morning. Of course, this didn't mean the Queen was frugal in all things. Far from it. Breakfast was still served on a silver tray. The milk arrived in a crystal jug. The linen napkins were embroidered. But the cereal, sealed away in humble containers that snapped shut with that satisfying plasticky click. The visual dissonance is irresistible. Picture it. Golden drapes, priceless artworks, a footman in white gloves placing down a silver pot of tea. And next to it, a squat little Tupperware box, possibly older than some of the staff, containing the royal supply of bran flakes. It's the kind of image that says more about Queen Elizabeth than most biographies. Because beneath the crowns and tiaras was a woman of routine, a woman raised in wartime, trained in self-discipline, surrounded by chaos and expectation. And in that context, choosing to store your breakfast in a way that keeps it fresh, regardless of how it looks, isn't just sensible. It's almost philosophical. There's something almost poetic about the Queen, who could summon chefs from across the Commonwealth, choosing instead to start her day the same way millions of her subjects did, quietly, precisely, and with an old plastic box that had probably outlived most of the palace's electronics. She could have had anything. She chose Tupperware. Because monarchy, when you strip it down far enough, isn't about opulence. It's about rituals. And rituals thrive on repetition, on small comforts, on predictable seals and airtight lids. And as strange as it is to imagine, that little tub of cereal may have been one of the few parts of her life she got to control fully, untouched by government, staff schedules, or tradition. But while the Queen was quietly measuring cornflakes, someone else in the family was whispering to his begonias. Because yes, Charles really does talk to his plants, out loud, and he always has. 24. Charles talked to his plants. Literally. Some royal rumors begin in scandal and end in silence. Others start as jokes and end up quoted in Parliament. And then there are the rumors so delightfully ridiculous, so perfectly absurd, that the only possible reaction is to laugh. Until you realize they're absolutely, undeniably true. Like the story that King Charles III, back when he was still Prince of Wales, used to talk to his plants. Not metaphorically, not as a literary flourish, not as a passing comment. No. The man literally walked through his gardens, leaned over his begonias, and spoke directly to them, in full sentences, with tone, intention, and the kind of conviction normally reserved for diplomats and debutantes. When this rumor first surfaced in the 1980s, it was met with widespread amusement. Headlines ranged from gentle ribbing to outright mockery. The tabloids ran with it, of course, painting the young prince as an eccentric oddball, mumbling to tulips while wearing wellies and quoting Shakespeare to ferns. Cartoonists had a field day. Comedians cracked jokes. Even some courtiers, off the record, seemed unsure if it was satire or genuine behavior. It didn't help that Charles had, by this point, already earned a reputation for being different. Where his father barked at mechanical problems and his mother silently dominated a room by just existing, Charles was introspective, sensitive, philosophical in a way that baffled and unnerved traditionalists. He read poetry. He painted watercolors. He spoke passionately about architecture, ecology, and the spiritual well-being of hedgerows. For a public used to stiff upper lips and military uniforms, he was more sandal than saber. So when the rumor emerged that he was holding conversations with his houseplants, it landed somewhere between punchline and prophecy. But then came the twist. Charles didn't deny it. In fact, he openly confirmed it. In a 1986 interview marking the 10th anniversary of his organic gardening initiative at Highgrove House, the Gloucestershire estate that became his personal Eden, Charles was asked directly about the rumor. Did he really talk to his plants? His answer was a calm, unbothered, "Yes, I do. I happily admit to it. I talk to them, and I think they respond." There it was. No spin. No damage control. Just an unapologetic confirmation that the heir to the British throne was having one-sided chats with his shrubs. The reaction was immediate and predictably divided. Critics howled. Columnists mocked. Some scientists dismissed it as fanciful nonsense, the sort of whimsical belief one might expect from someone who also believed in homeopathy and ley lines. Others, however, especially those in the more holistic or environmental sciences, nodded approvingly. Because here's the thing, Charles was ahead of his time. Long before sustainability became a palace buzzword, long before climate change became part of state speeches, Charles was warning about soil degradation, habitat loss, and the spiritual disconnect between humans and nature. To him, speaking to plants wasn't about delusion, it was about respect. He believed that plants, like all living things, responded to attention. That tending a garden wasn't just about watering and trimming, but about forming a kind of relationship. One that encouraged observation, presence, and yes, conversation. And while science hasn't fully confirmed whether talking to plants actually helps them grow, some studies have shown that plants exposed to certain sounds or vibrations do respond differently. But Charles wasn't waiting for scientific consensus. He was, as ever, following a kind of ancient logic, one rooted more in intuition than in measurable proof. Staff at Highgrove confirmed that it wasn't an occasional novelty. It was a habit. He would walk among the beds in the early morning, crouch down, touch the leaves, and speak quietly, sometimes offering encouragement, sometimes chiding a slow-growing rose. Sometimes, they said, just being present. A man in a garden trying to make sense of a world that rarely gave him peace. And that's the part that rarely makes it into the headlines. Because for Charles, the plants were never just plants. They were sanctuary. In a life defined by public duty, media pressure, family dysfunction, and constitutional limbo, the garden was one place where he didn't need to perform. He could be himself, odd, poetic, occasionally verbose. And no one judged. Not the trees, not the soil, certainly not the lavender bushes. It's no coincidence that his happiest years, according to those closest to him, were often spent in that garden, wellies caked in dirt, hands stained green, talking to things that couldn't talk back, and loving them for it. So yes, Charles talked to his plants. Not because he thought they were listening, but because someone needed to. And while his plant whispering may have inspired ridicule in its day, history now sees it differently, not as folly, but as foresight. A small act of attention in a world that had, even then, begun to lose its connection to the natural rhythm of things. But not all royals found calm in quiet gardens. Some, like Princess Margaret, preferred a very different kind of ritual, one that required a custom bath, preheated water, and the unwavering certainty that no hotel in the world would ever get it right without her own personal supply. Yes, she traveled with her own bathwater. 25. Princess Margaret traveled with her own bathwater. There are luxury travel habits, and then there is Princess Margaret. A woman who didn't just live like royalty, she demanded it, even in the smallest and steamiest corners of her itinerary. She was, as her biographers often put it with diplomatic restraint, particular. But particular doesn't quite cover it when the rumor in question is that Princess Margaret, younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, Countess of Snowdon, socialite, chain smoker, style icon, and professional contradiction, once traveled with her own bathwater. At first glance, the claim sounds like pure parody, something The Onion might invent, something out of a post-war satire on the excesses of inherited privilege. Imagine it. An aide, suitcase in hand, nervously protecting a few dozen liters of pre-selected British bathwater as they journey to a hotel in Italy, or perhaps a French chateau, where the local plumbing simply won't do. But here's the twist. This rumor, too, turned out to be true. And not just true in spirit or technically correct. Literally true. According to multiple former staffers, Margaret's travel routine included, among other things, very strict bathing requirements. Her bath had to be filled to a precise depth. The water had to be at a specific temperature, never guessed, always measured. It had to reach exactly 7 inches, and the water was not to be hotter than 68 degrees Fahrenheit. She did not draw it herself. She did not adjust it. If the bath failed to meet specifications, she would either send it back, like an overcooked steak, or make her displeasure known in the way only Margaret could, with cold detachment, velvet sarcasm, and silence sharp enough to draw blood. Now, most of this was public knowledge by the 1980s. The British press, always eager for stories that combined glamour and dysfunction, delighted in tales of Margaret's fastidiousness. But the real headline, the one whispered in diplomatic back channels and staff corridors, was that on at least one occasion, she refused to bathe using foreign hotel water, and instead had bottled water shipped from England, specifically for her bath. Whether this was superstition, distrust, or just deeply entrenched snobbery is anyone's guess. Margaret never explained herself. She didn't need to. She had grown up in a system where questioning a royal's whims was considered worse than forgetting the national anthem. And Margaret's whims weren't just indulged, they were anticipated. If the bath wasn't ready, you weren't ready. It's worth noting that Margaret didn't consider this eccentricity. To her, it was simply the standard, the royal way. She had been raised in opulence, marinated in privilege from birth, surrounded by flunkies and footmen and floral arrangements that cost more than the average British mortgage. For Margaret, the world outside the palace wasn't real. It was a temporary inconvenience she had to endure between house parties and royal tours. And baths? Baths were sacred. Every morning, without exception, she would begin her day with a long, meticulously prepared soak. According to her former lady-in-waiting, this ritual could last for over an hour. No interruptions were permitted. Phone calls were deferred, meetings delayed. You could run a small country in the time it took Margaret to rise from the tub and have her hair done. And if the bath had been drawn with substandard water, water with too much chlorine, too many minerals, or, God forbid, a strange smell, then the whole day was effectively ruined. Which brings us to the absurd genius of the rumor. Because while some royals express control through diplomacy or scheduling, Margaret expressed hers through domestic ritual. The bath wasn't just a bath, it was a statement, a line in the marble, a way of saying, I am not like you. Not out of cruelty, just out of certainty. She was royal. The world bent around her preferences. That was how it worked. And yes, she smoked in the bath, and drank in the bath, and, in at least one documented case, took meetings in the bath. There are stories of aides standing awkwardly outside the bathroom door, delivering updates while she puffed a cigarette and hummed along to the radio, submerged beneath water that may or may not have been imported from England. The rumor, when it finally escaped the palace walls, was met with disbelief, until it was quietly confirmed by those who had been there. It wasn't every trip, said one former royal valet, but it happened. She thought foreign water made her skin itchy, or maybe she just didn't trust hotel plumbing. Either way, the message was clear. The bath was non-negotiable. The water was curated. The towels were warmed. The soap was French. The music was classical. The cigarette was lit. And if you couldn't understand why that mattered, well, you probably weren't invited. Margaret's life was built on contradictions. She craved normality but hated mediocrity. She longed for privacy but adored attention. She was too aristocratic for the real world and too emotional for the royal one. And in the middle of all that chaos, she found her peace in a bath so controlled it may as well have been a performance installation. And speaking of royal rituals hiding in plain sight, there's another strange rumor that turned out to be delightfully true, one involving the Queen, a handbag, and a secret hook she carried with her everywhere. 26. Queen Elizabeth II kept a portable hook in her handbag. For a monarch who spent over 70 years cultivating the art of silence, Queen Elizabeth II somehow managed to communicate entire conversations with a mere glance, a posture shift, or apparently a handbag. Yes, the Queen's handbag, often dismissed as a mere accessory, was in fact the Swiss Army knife of her public life. It held secrets. It sent coded signals. It became such a staple of her image that no one really questioned its purpose. Why does a monarch need a handbag? She didn't pay for anything. She didn't carry keys. She certainly didn't need a phone. So what was inside? Over the decades, a slow trickle of palace leaks and former staff confessions revealed a handful of objects the Queen always carried. A folded $5 note for the church collection plate, mints, reading glasses, a lipstick, used only in private, a fountain pen, and of course her signature Launer handbag, a brand she was loyal to for over 50 years. But buried in the folds of this royal inventory was a detail so peculiar, so wonderfully logistical, that it sounded like a punchline. The Queen carried a portable suction cup handbag hook, a discreet, clever little device she could whip out and affix to the underside of any table. Why? So she could hang her handbag in exactly the right place. Not on the floor, never on the back of a chair, certainly not handed off to a member of staff like some amateur duchess. No, the Queen's handbag was never left dangling, flopping, or misplaced. It had a system. The rumor first emerged through the usual back channels, a former footman here, a biographer there, all hinting at this strange royal gadget. It sounded too precise, too pedestrian to be true. After all, this was a woman whose daily schedule was governed by ceremonial precision, whose meals were tested by tasters, whose Christmas gifts were sometimes exchanged with German nobility. And yet, according to multiple insiders and even one ex-butler turned consultant, the Queen indeed kept a small hook in her bag. Practical. Which is perhaps the most surprising thing about it. Because when you imagine royal eccentricities, you expect something decadent, like commissioning an orchestra to accompany breakfast, like a careful grandmother in a motorway cafe, quietly securing her bag under the table so it doesn't get dirty. But then again, that was Elizabeth. She lived her life between extremes, ceremonial and domestic, untouchable yet ordinary, revered yet grounded, however small. The handbag itself, of course, was also a code book. According to palace sources, when she switched the handbag from one hand to the other, it was a secret signal to her aides. Rescue me from this conversation. If she placed it on the table, it meant she wanted to leave within 5 minutes. If she set it on the floor, the exit should happen immediately. But none of that worked if the handbag couldn't be placed. It needed a fixed point, somewhere reliable, somewhere that didn't violate etiquette or require a royal to stoop to floor level. Enter. The hook. Always ready, always elegant, always just out of view, much like the Queen herself. And if you think this sounds excessive, consider this. The Queen met with an estimated 15 different prime ministers, visited over 120 countries, and attended thousands of official events. Each venue, each building, each table, unpredictable. The lighting might change, the room temperature might vary. But one thing the Queen could control was where her handbag went. There's something strangely poetic about it. In a world where she could never truly be alone, where nothing was private, where every gesture became symbol and every word a headline, she found sovereignty in the details. A hook, a hinge, a silent decision to keep her belongings exactly where she wanted them, without needing to ask anyone or rely on anyone to carry them for her. It's not opulence, it's order. And for a woman who reigned over more constitutional crises, political transitions, and awkward garden parties than any leader in modern history, that kind of control matters. Because behind the diamonds and declarations, the queen was, in many ways, a minimalist. Not in aesthetic, but in habits. Everything had a place. Everything served a purpose. Even the bizarre little hook in her handbag. And while this quiet quirk might seem like the kind of detail that defines a monarch who knew how to handle herself, the next rumor reveals a royal who preferred to let someone else do the handling. Because, believe it or not, Prince Charles once hired a man solely to iron his shoelaces. 27. Prince Charles hired a man just to iron his shoelaces. In a kingdom where pomp and pageantry are a daily occurrence and where servants sometimes outnumber houseplants, royal eccentricities have a way of becoming strangely normalized. Still, every now and then a rumor surfaces that manages to pierce even the most jaded public sensibilities. One so ridiculous, so wildly specific, that it temporarily reawakens the absurdity of it all. Such is the case with the whisper, long dismissed as parody, that Prince Charles once hired a man whose job was to iron his shoelaces. Just the laces. Nothing more. It sounds like the kind of thing you'd hear in a satirical sketch about the idle rich. A posh cartoon character reclining in a velvet chair as a butler carefully presses tiny loops of cotton with tweezers in a miniature iron, all while classical music plays softly in the background. For years, this was how the public interpreted it. A joke, an exaggeration, a half-truth passed down through exaggerated retellings. Until former royal staffers, no longer bound by silence or employment contracts, confirmed it. Yes, it was true. The man was not merely a shoelace technician. He was part of Charles's larger valet team, and his responsibilities included a range of duties related to the prince's personal wardrobe. Among them, ensuring that his shoelaces were cleaned, flattened, and pressed to perfection before each wear. The goal? No visible creases, no unsightly twists, no spontaneous curling or unruly loops. The laces had to lie perfectly flat as they threaded through the eyelets, forming a symmetrical bow worthy of royal ankles. At first glance, it's hard to imagine why anyone would care. After all, the shoelaces in question weren't going to be the focus of a photo op. No global summit was going to turn on the elegance of Charles's Oxfords. But this wasn't about appearances, not entirely. For Charles, these habits were rooted in ritual and precision, the deeply ingrained routines that helped him maintain a sense of order in a life otherwise dictated by others. Because make no mistake, while being a royal comes with power in theory, in practice, it can be alarmingly restrictive. Every handshake, meal, and movement is pre-scheduled. Privacy is minimal. Personal agency often is a myth. In that context, meticulous personal routines can become a quiet form of self-sovereignty. And for Charles, whose mind has always leaned toward structure, the precise alignment of clothing, down to the state of his laces, became a non-negotiable. According to Paul Burrell, former butler to Princess Diana and previously in service to Charles, the prince's daily dressing routine was an orchestration. The bathwater was drawn to a specific temperature. The plug was positioned just so. The pajamas were laid out with military precision. The toothpaste, pre-squeezed onto the brush. And the shoelaces, well, the shoelaces were ironed. Staff reportedly used a small, low-heat iron and a damp cloth to press them, ensuring the fabric retained its shape without singeing or stretching. Once ironed, the laces would be relaced into the shoes, also polished daily, and placed beside the prince's wardrobe, ready for the day's schedule, which may or may not include greeting dignitaries, touring organic farms, or having earnest conversations with shrubbery. To outsiders, This sounds like madness. And perhaps it is, in the same way all rituals verge on madness when stripped of their context. But inside royal walls, where everything is ceremonial and nothing is spontaneous, this level of detail is more common than you'd think. What makes this instance stand out is just how microscopic, how pedestrian the task seems. Ironing shoelaces doesn't signal extravagance. It signals obsession. It's not about flaunting wealth. It's about achieving a kind of impossible order, a world where even the smallest threads are under control. And let's not forget, Charles was raised in this system. Born into a family where staff were responsible for everything from drawing curtains to decanting milk, where fathers were distant and mothers were more sovereign than maternal. His childhood was lived under scrutiny, his adolescence marred by boarding school indifference, and his adulthood shaped by relentless expectation. In that vacuum, perfectionism took root. To him, an ironed shoelace wasn't an indulgence. It was discipline. It was correctness. It was one more variable that didn't have to go wrong. Of course, this didn't stop the public from mocking it, nor should it have. There is something deliciously absurd about a man whose job includes pressing bits of string for a living. Even Downton Abbey didn't go that far. And yet, there's something tragic too. A reminder that inside these gilded lives, the pursuit of control can drift into compulsion. The desire for immaculate laces isn't just about fashion. It's about peace, or the illusion of it. And speaking of illusions, some things the royal family tried to keep hidden turned out to be real after all. Because while most children sneak out for candy or parties, young Elizabeth once did something far more daring. She snuck out of Buckingham Palace in disguise during World War II, and no one noticed until it was too late. 28. The Queen did sneak out of Buckingham Palace in disguise. During it sounds like a premise for a historical spy thriller. Wartime London, blackout curtains, air raid sirens wailing in the distance, and a teenage girl, no ordinary girl, but a future queen, slipping out of the royal gates in disguise, vanishing into the streets with a borrowed coat and borrowed name. But this wasn't fiction. It wasn't even scandal. It was, in its own strange and understated way, a true royal coming-of-age story. For decades, the rumor lingered in whispered form that during the height of World War II, Princess Elizabeth, as she was then known, had escaped the heavy formality of palace life for just one night, just one, to join the public as they celebrated VE Day. Victory in Europe. The end of war. It was a story dismissed by many as sentimental myth. Surely a teenage royal would never be allowed to slip through the gates of Buckingham Palace, let alone blend into the frenzied crowds of London. The very idea, a young Elizabeth, future monarch, anonymous among the masses, seemed implausible. And yet, every word of it was true. The date was May 8, 1945. Germany had surrendered. After 6 long years of bombs, rationing, separation, and grief, Britain exhaled. The war wasn't truly over. Not everywhere, but it felt like it. That night, the city erupted in spontaneous joy. London turned into a festival ground, dancing in the streets, strangers embracing strangers, fireworks lighting up skies that for years had only held dread. And 2 young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, watched from inside their gilded cage, staring out at a city they barely knew, their entire lives having been shaped by war from behind fortified walls. The Queen later confirmed the story herself, decades afterward, in her characteristically restrained and retrospective tone. "We asked my parents if we could go out and see for ourselves," she recalled in a rare admission of mischief. And astonishingly, they said yes. With the King and Queen's blessing, Elizabeth, 19, and Margaret, 14, were allowed to join the crowds. Not as royals, not as figureheads. According to accounts from her contemporaries, the princesses joined the crowds outside the palace, cheering along with everyone else, anonymously celebrating in front of their own home. They walked down the mall, sang along to songs they'd only ever heard on the radio, and mingled with servicemen and civilians alike. One anonymous witness years later recalled a moment when a tall, dignified young woman in uniform passed by and said something softly in perfect upper-crust English. "That was the moment I realized," the witness said. "She wasn't just any girl." Princess Margaret predictably loved the whole thing, the noise, the spontaneity, the flirtation with strangers. Elizabeth, ever the more serious of the two, reportedly drank in the moment with a kind of restrained awe. It was the first, and perhaps last, time she was truly part of the crowd. What makes the story resonate isn't just its novelty, it's the contrast. Here was a girl born into rigid routine, trained for duty from birth, whose daily life was choreographed to the minute. And yet for one electric night, she tasted the very thing monarchy tries to keep at arm's length: anonymity, spontaneity, messy, unfiltered joy. And it wasn't a rebellion. It was a request. She didn't sneak out in defiance. She asked permission. And the king, himself an anxious and deeply moral man, granted it. Perhaps because even he understood that this moment belonged to the people and to his daughters as much as anyone else. Years later, the Queen would speak of that night with the same quiet pride she reserved for her service during the war. Not as scandal, but as a memory carved out of history, a brief window where duty and identity blurred, and she became not a monarch, but simply Elizabeth. There's something hauntingly beautiful about it, a night when the future Queen of England stood shoulder to shoulder with her subjects, and no one recognized her, not because they weren't looking, but because she didn't want to be seen. Just this once. And as that night faded into history, it left behind not a scandal or a secret, but a rare, human moment. A reminder that even royalty craves freedom, even if only for a few hours under the cover of laughter and light. But of course, not all royal disguises were so noble. Because if you thought sneaking out in wartime was risky, wait until you hear about the time Prince Harry dressed as Spider-Man at Sandhurst. 29. Prince Harry really did dress as Spider-Man at Sandhurst. When the British press began whispering that Prince Harry once dressed up as Spider-Man at Sandhurst, most people assumed it was a joke, a dorm room myth, a second-hand gag passed down from one red-faced cadet to another after a few pints too many. Because of all the places one could imagine a royal slipping into spandex, Sandhurst, the British Army's elite officer training academy, ranks dead last. This is the place that polishes discipline like a trophy. The kind of institution where shoes are shined to within an inch of their lives, uniforms are crisp enough to slice paper, and humor is tolerated only in strictly measured testosterone-sanctioned doses. In other words, not your average Comic-Con. So the idea that the younger prince, fifth in line at the time, hot off the tabloids for a series of public antics, donned a superhero costume at one of the most serious regimented institutions in the UK was just absurd enough to be believable. And yes, it was true. The incident happened during Harry's early days at Sandhurst, where he enrolled in 2005 under the name Officer Cadet Wales, a nod to his father's title, and a feeble attempt to fly under the radar. That attempt lasted approximately 12 minutes. Though the staff and students treated him with the same clinical roughness as everyone else, military decorum, after all, applies even to the monarchy, his presence was still an open secret. People noticed when he walked into a room. They noticed even more when he walked into one dressed as Spider-Man. According to accounts later confirmed by multiple instructors and fellow cadets, the costume incident occurred during an unofficial dorm celebration, one of those rare moments in military life where formality gives way to forced fun. The kind of night where even the most hardened instructors look the other way, as long as no one loses a limb or sets anything historically significant on fire. The occasion? A themed party. Although what the theme was remains contested. Some say it was childhood heroes. Others insist it was a film character night. What everyone agrees on is that Harry showed up in full Spider-Man regalia, complete with the mask, red and blue suit, and an energy that could only be described as unroyally enthusiastic. Not a half-hearted costume, not a token cape or ironic t-shirt, the full outfit. It was not a disguise, it was a choice. And according to some, it wasn't even a bad one. He reportedly pulled it off with a level of commitment that bordered on theatrical. There were mock web-slinging poses. There were unsolicited heroic stances on dorm furniture. At least one person claims he attempted to scale a wall, though that detail may have been added later for dramatic effect. And here's the strange part. No one was particularly shocked. By this point in his life, Harry had already begun cultivating a public image that balanced the expectations of a soldier with the unpredictability of a student who partied harder than most tabloids could keep up with. His appearance in a Spider-Man costume wasn't a betrayal of character. It was an extension of it. A brief moment where the weight of lineage and protocol could be peeled away, replaced by spandex and sarcasm. And yet, even this moment, ridiculous as it was, had layers. Because Harry wasn't just any cadet. He wasn't just any royal. He was a young man straddling the worlds of military duty and media circus. A teenager whose grief had been televised, whose rebellion was commodified, and whose personal life was international entertainment. At Sandhurst, he was finally in a space that didn't care about titles, where he could be judged, harshly but fairly, by his actions, not his ancestry. And for all its intensity, the Academy gave him a kind of structure he craved. Which is perhaps why the Spider-Man moment feels less like a prank and more like a relief valve, a private joke, shared with people who would soon become his comrades. An expression of absurdity in a place built on absolute seriousness. A kind of goofy rebellion, but a safe one, and notably, one in which he was still in character. Because Spider-Man, after all, is the patron saint of double lives. A teenager behind a mask. Someone forced to grow up quickly, burdened by responsibility, but still clinging to something lighthearted and strange. In retrospect, it's hard to think of a more accidentally perfect symbol for young Prince Harry at the time. Years later, when asked about Sandhurst, Harry would describe it as transformative. It was the place where he finally felt like he had purpose, where he wasn't Prince Harry but Cadet Wales, where he learned to command, to listen, to follow orders without question, even if those orders sometimes came from a sergeant who'd just seen him leap off a bench dressed like a Marvel character. It's one of those weird royal stories that sounds too ridiculous to be true until you realize that, of course, it's true. Because what else do you expect from a family where the Queen uses a handbag to signal distress and Charles has a valet for shoelaces? But even a Spider-Man suit has nothing on the next rumor. A royal quirk so strange, so wildly over the top, it still doesn't sound real, even though it absolutely is. Because the Queen's corgis had their own chef. Naturally. 30. The Queen's corgis had their own chef. In the royal hierarchy of British life, there are nobles, there are commoners, and then there are the corgis. Those short-legged, sharp-eared, fiercely pampered creatures who padded through the halls of Buckingham Palace like they owned the place. Because in a way they did. For over 8 decades, Queen Elizabeth II's love of corgis was no secret. From childhood until her final years, they were her most consistent companions. Photos of her surrounded by a small army of Pembroke Welsh corgis became as iconic as her hats, handbags, and stony glances. They were there during state visits, family holidays, and even funeral processions. Loyal, yappy, and distinctly unimpressed by pageantry, the corgis were the only beings in the palace who could bark at a prime minister and get away with it. Still, even among all the well-known tales of royal pet devotion, one rumor stood out as too absurd, too extravagantly niche to be real. The Queen had a personal chef just for her corgis. Surely not. Surely there was a limit, even in Buckingham Palace. And yet, confirmed. All of it. Down to the last hand-chopped rabbit liver. The Queen's dogs didn't just eat well, they ate like minor nobility. Better, some would argue, than most human beings. Their meals were prepared daily by a dedicated team of royal kitchen staff who followed a rotating menu crafted specifically for their canine clients. No kibble, no cans, no table scraps. According to Darren McGrady, the Queen's former personal chef, there was a formal dog menu posted outside the royal kitchens, updated regularly depending on the dog's health, preferences, or seasonal considerations. Meals included dishes like rabbit, beef, chicken, and lamb, all freshly cooked, diced to exacting specifications, and often mixed with rice and vegetables for balance. The meat had to be free of bones. The rice had to be just tender enough. And the vegetables? Never seasoned, never overcooked, a sprinkle of chopped parsley maybe. But no garlic, nothing risky, no experiments. This was the Queen's Corgi Brigade. Their digestion was a matter of state. Each dog had their own bowl, their own place at feeding time, and, according to staff, a sense of expectation that rivaled most ambassadors. If dinner was late, there would be barking. If the portions were uneven, there would be glares. The corgis were known to nip at staff who displeased them, and to form complex hierarchies amongst themselves, with alpha dogs earning first dibs at the food bowls. The Queen, for her part, personally supervised many of their meals. She didn't just care in theory, she cared ritually. It wasn't unusual for her to read out their names while the food was being served, ensuring each dog got their proper share. There was an unspoken understanding in the palace. You could mess up a state banquet. You could forget the correct protocol for greeting a Saudi prince. But you did not mess with the corgi menu. And it wasn't just about pampering. For the Queen, the corgis represented a link to something real. In a life filled with symbolic gestures and scripted interactions, they were creatures who responded to her with instinct, not protocol. They didn't care if she'd signed 5 bills that morning or survived a constitutional crisis. They wanted chicken. They wanted it now. And if it wasn't warm enough, someone was going to hear about it. Perhaps that's why she indulged them. Because the corgis didn't just live with the Queen, they were part of her. From the time she was a young girl given her first corgi, Dookie, in the 1930s, through to her final years with her last few aging pets, they were a constant presence. They witnessed it all. Coronations, divorces, wars, jubilees, prime ministers rising and falling. Always there, underfoot, yapping at footmen, tangling leashes with diplomats, and sleeping in their own palace suite, complete with raised wicker beds and fresh sheets. And yes, they had their own Christmas stockings. This isn't to say the Queen was oblivious to how ridiculous it all sounded. She wasn't. By all accounts, she had a dry, knowing sense of humor about her dogs, even the chaos they caused. But she also never apologized for her affection. They were loyal. They were hers. And loyalty, in royal life, is rare. That's what makes this rumor, now fully verified, so compelling. It's not just about extravagant meals or silver-plated bowls. It's about the idea that behind the diamond tiaras and gilded thrones, the Queen was happiest when surrounded by a half-dozen short-legged dogs demanding luxury meats and snapping at courtiers. Because if there was ever a metaphor for the British monarchy, it's a pack of royal corgis. Loud, pampered, stubborn, occasionally terrifying, but somehow, against all odds, enduring. And speaking of royal disguise, pampered rebellion, and strange midnight adventures. You've probably heard the rumor that Princess Diana once pretended to be a man to sneak into a nightclub with Freddie Mercury. Well, that one? It's true too. And it's even more surreal than you think. 31. Princess Diana once pretended to be a man to sneak into a nightclub. It's the kind of rumor that sounds like pure celebrity fan fiction, a scene from a lost 80s rom-com, or maybe a late-night stand-up routine. A princess, a rock star, and a drag club walk into a bar. Except this isn't a joke, and the punchline is very real. Princess Diana, the most photographed woman on Earth, once dressed as a man to sneak into a gay nightclub in London, alongside none other than Freddie Mercury. And not just any night, not just any disguise. This was full-on espionage by way of eyeliner. The story emerged years after Diana's death, when her friends, including actress Cleo Rokos and comedy legend Kenny Everett, finally confirmed the details in interviews and memoirs. It had been whispered about for years in London nightlife circles. But like most Diana-related rumors, it lived in the blurry space between urban legend and wishful thinking. After all, this was the future Queen of Hearts, mother to a future king, gallivanting through Soho in drag? Surely not. But then came the confirmations, and suddenly, it wasn't just possible. It was deliciously true. The year was 1988. Diana was in her late 20s, already drowning in fame, public pressure, and a marriage visibly cracking at the seams. Her public image was that of a demure, compassionate royal, but privately, she was testing boundaries. She was restless, sardonic, and increasingly fed up with playing the perfect princess in a world that didn't want her to speak or stray. So when her close friend Kenny Everett, a DJ and comedian known for pushing every envelope, and singer Freddie Mercury invited her to hang out one night, she didn't just say yes. She wanted to go with them to the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, a legendary London gay bar known for its outrageous drag performances, raucous energy, and absolute refusal to take anything seriously. Mercury and Everett were skeptical. The place was wild on a normal night, let alone when a literal royal icon might walk in. "You'll be recognized in a second," they told her. "The whole club will shut down." But Diana had a plan. She didn't want to sit in a VIP room. She didn't want special treatment. She wanted to blend in. So she rummaged through Kenny Everett's wardrobe, grabbed a military-style bomber jacket, aviator sunglasses, and a black leather cap, and transformed herself from Princess of Wales to, well, something between a punk roadie and a backup dancer from an off-brand music video. The transformation wasn't perfect. She still looked like a very elegant person wearing someone else's clothes. But combined with the venue's general mayhem, the darkness of the room, and the overall disbelief that Diana would be anywhere near the place, it actually worked. They entered. No fanfare, no entourage, no whispered gasps of recognition. Just four friends walking into a bar like it was the most normal thing in the world. According to Cleo Rokos, the moment was surreal. "It was like a college prank," she recalled. Diana loved it. She said it was one of the best nights of her life. For a few brief hours, she wasn't surrounded by photographers, courtiers, or expectations. She was anonymous, free, just another weirdo at a weird bar on a weird night in a city that didn't care who you were, as long as you danced. The staff didn't recognize her, neither did the patrons, and if anyone did get suspicious, they kept it to themselves, probably assuming she was just another particularly glamorous guest enjoying the chaos. After all, everyone at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern was in disguise. Diana's was just better than most. She didn't drink much, she didn't perform, she didn't cause a scene. She just existed, which, for someone whose life was lived entirely in the spotlight, must have felt radically transgressive. It's hard to overstate how unthinkable this was at the time. Diana was still a working royal, still married, still expected to project composure, duty, restraint. She wasn't supposed to have a nightlife, much less one that included cross-dressing escapades with gay icons. But Diana was already beginning to rewrite her own narrative, not with press statements or rebellions, but with small acts of personal defiance. This night was one of them. The rumor, when it finally went public, was met with the usual media cocktail: disbelief, amusement, admiration. Many dismissed it as fabricated, until enough insiders confirmed the details that it became quietly accepted fact. And while some saw it as a quirky footnote, Others viewed it differently, as one of the first real signs that Diana wasn't just a symbol. She was a person, with her own desires, her own mischief, her own need for anonymity. That night, the People's Princess vanished into a crowd that didn't ask questions, and she loved every second of it. But speaking of public moments that took bizarre turns, let's move from drag clubs to rabbits. Yes, the next rumor is the one that even Buckingham's staff used to laugh at, until witnesses confirmed it, because it turns out Camilla was once attacked by a rabbit and had to be rescued. 32. Camilla once had to be rescued from a rabbit attack. For most people, royal engagements involve ribbon cuttings, awkward small talk, and pretending to care about commemorative plaques. Occasionally there's a handshake, a bouquet, and a grimace hidden behind a smile. But in Camilla's case, Duchess of Cornwall, now Queen Consort, one official outing took a spectacular turn into the absurd. According to witnesses, she was once surrounded by rabbits and had to be rescued. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't satire. It happened. And not just a bunny hopping across a path or a cute animal moment gone slightly rogue. We're talking about a full, fluffy ambush. The kind of surreal encounter that seems to happen only to royals, who appear to attract these things like minor curses from a mischievous universe. Let's set the scene. The Duchess was visiting a farm, as royals often do, in the British countryside. The location changes in the retellings. Some say Cornwall, others point to Wales. But the core of the story remains consistent. Camilla was being given a grand tour of a local agricultural project, something involving sustainability, school children, and livestock. She was in the middle of her usual diplomatic duties, listening attentively, nodding at volunteers, pretending the press cameras weren't there, when someone had the idea to bring out the rabbits. Harmless, right? What happened next has been described by onlookers as comical if you were watching, and mildly alarming if you were the Duchess of Cornwall. The rabbits, most likely accustomed to regular feeding and a certain amount of human interaction, were brought out in baskets and pens as a sort of photo opportunity. But instead of docilely posing for cameras or letting children stroke their velvety heads, they apparently took one look at the Duchess and decided collectively to swarm. They ran toward her, all of them. Now, a rabbit running toward you might sound adorable. 1 or 2? Fine. 3? Maybe a charming anecdote. But a herd, or more accurately, a fluffle, of fast, determined rabbits surging in your direction like a cotton ball cavalry. That's a different story. According to several people present, Camilla initially laughed. That classic royal amusement reserved for surprise encounters with animals and small children. But as more rabbits joined in, brushing up against her legs, nibbling inquisitively at her coat and handbag, and showing no signs of stopping, her laughter reportedly turned to unease. One witness described the moment with dry understatement. She looked suddenly very interested in where the exit was. Another, less diplomatic, put it more bluntly. She was completely surrounded. You couldn't see her shoes anymore. It wasn't that the rabbits were aggressive in any traditional sense. They weren't biting. There was no blood, no shrieking. But they were enthusiastic. Perhaps too enthusiastic. And they had absolutely no interest in respecting royal personal space. Aides stepped in, of course. One reached out to gently shoo a rabbit away from Camilla's calf. Another tried to intercept the boldest of the bunch, who appeared to be trying to climb onto her foot. But rabbits are fast, low to the ground, and, in sufficient numbers, incredibly hard to corral. What followed was several minutes of awkward hopping, rustling, and royal wincing, as staff attempted to extricate the Duchess from her rapidly encroaching admirers. In the end, she was politely escorted out of the rabbit pen by 2 security officers and a local handler, while the rabbits, undeterred, continued sniffing the air in her direction, perhaps still expecting a treat or a title. The photos from the day are incredible if you can find them. Camilla mid-laugh, mid-flinch, surrounded by tufts of moving fluff. a surrealist oil painting of English diplomacy at its finest. And the best part? She took it in stride. Camilla, say what you will, has always had a sharp sense of humor and a healthy grasp on the ridiculousness of her role. In post-incident interviews, she reportedly joked about being mugged by rabbits and warned future hosts to bring fewer next time. Palace aides, clearly trying not to laugh, made vague statements about an energetic display of affection from the animals, which is perhaps the most diplomatically British way to describe being overrun by a gang of rabbits. What this moment reveals, aside from the perils of overly enthusiastic farm mascots, is how even the most staged, curated public event can collapse into beautiful chaos. The kind of unpredictability that no press briefing can prevent, no royal handler can diffuse, and no protocol guide can cover. It also highlights the peculiar burden of royalty, to remain poised, gracious, and photogenic, even while being swarmed by small mammals. Most people would have panicked, tripped, or fled. Camilla smiled, winced, and kept calm, because that's the job. Still, you have to wonder what went through her mind in that moment. Did she silently curse the PR assistant who approved the rabbit segment? Did she reconsider every life decision that had led her from the pages of gossip columns to the center of a livestock ambush? Or maybe, just maybe, she thought, at least it's not corgis. Because in the grand list of bizarre royal entanglements, this one is fluffy, surreal, and somehow still less strange than the next rumor, which, against all odds, is even more niche. You see, King Charles III insists on bringing his own custom-made ice cube tray, because the shape and size of the cubes must be just right. 33. King Charles III always brings a custom-made ice cube tray with exact cube shapes. In a world where monarchs reign over centuries-old institutions and grapple with abstract ideas like duty, legacy, and constitutional symbolism, it's oddly comforting and slightly absurd to know that King Charles III reportedly insists on bringing his own custom-made ice cube tray with him when he travels. Not a fancy one, not gilded or jewel-encrusted, just a very particular tray that produces ice cubes in a very particular shape and size, because apparently standard cubes simply will not do. For years, this rumor was passed around like a joke, whispered at the edges of cocktail parties. The kind of bizarrely specific detail too weird to be real, and too weird not to be real. It sounded like a parody of aristocratic fastidiousness. The kind of fictional detail a screenwriter would invent to add comic relief to a monarch otherwise burdened by ceremony and suppressed emotion. But, as with so many details of royal life, it turned out to be true. Multiple former royal staff members, most notably Paul Burrell, once butler to both Charles and Diana, have confirmed that Charles not only travels with his own toilet seat, yes, that one's also real, but also demands that his ice be made to his specifications. The cubes must be perfectly square, crack-free, and identical in size. Some reports go so far as to say he even dislikes the clinking sound of irregular ice cubes in a glass, preferring silent, symmetrical cubes that melt at a consistent pace. Let's pause to take that in. The King of England is acoustically offended by irregular ice. And while it's easy to scoff, and many have, it's also strangely revealing. Because in the surreal theater of royal life, where everything is already ceremonial and artificial, what could possibly be more real than a man obsessing over the shape of his ice? This isn't just about fussiness. It's not about taste, per se. It's about control. The one thing royals are constantly denied in every other aspect of life. Born into public expectation, raised by nannies, photographed into adulthood, and groomed for a role he couldn't possibly define himself, Charles, like every monarch in waiting, had to endure a life of waiting rooms and polished platitudes. Every decision was made for him, every word scrutinized. So it makes a certain kind of twisted sense that he would zero in on the few details he could dictate. Ice cubes apparently became one of them. His preference isn't just anecdotal. Palace insiders say Charles has gone so far as to travel with a full portable bar setup, including his own glassware, bottle of preferred whiskey, and that damn ice tray, just in case the hotel or host doesn't meet his hydration standards. It's worth noting that he's not alone in this level of absurd precision. Royals across history have been weirdly obsessive about the physical details of their environment. Queen Elizabeth had a portable hook in her handbag to hang it under tables. Prince Philip reportedly had a preferred grill spot on the palace grounds where he would cook breakfast himself, regardless of the season. And Charles? He wants symmetrical ice. It's as if royal life is so completely stage-managed that the only way to feel human is to be bizarre. And here's the deeper irony. The man who famously champions sustainability, organic farming, and eco-conscious living is also a man who flies with an ice tray to make his drinks feel emotionally stable. This isn't hypocrisy, it's contradiction, which is far more interesting. Charles is a walking tangle of contradictions, modern and archaic, environmentally progressive and hilariously pampered, intensely spiritual and pathologically detail-obsessed. But even his critics have to admit he's consistent. Whether it's the cufflink angle, the toothpaste squeezed exactly an inch up the tube, or the ice cube shaped like minimalist sculpture, Charles brings the same intensity to domestic rituals that he brings to diplomatic conversations. That's just who he is. The man once shook hands with a tree. On purpose. He talks to plants. Also true. And yes, he'll drink his whiskey only if it's accompanied by the right geometry of frozen water. The British public's reaction to this revelation has been predictably mixed. Some laughed. Some rolled their eyes. Some said, "Well, it's his ice, innit?" Others pointed out, not unfairly, that if your main job is to exist, you're probably going to develop opinions about ice. You'd almost be more suspicious if he didn't. And the thing is, once you start looking for the absurdity in royal habits, it's everywhere. It's not about the extravagance. It's about the pattern, the tendency toward ritual, the illusion of control, the slow creep of eccentricity that begins with a preference and ends with a custom travel cooler labeled His Majesty's Ice. So yes, the ice cube rumor is real. And it's the perfect full stop for this entire parade of absurd truths. A final, freezing, perfectly symmetrical metaphor for what the British monarchy actually is. Ancient, ridiculous, hyper-curated, and deeply obsessed with appearances, temperature, and control. Because in the end, the weirdest thing about the royal family isn't the corgis or the hooks or the shoelaces or the rabbits. It's that all of it is true, and we still can't look away.